Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the meeting of the London Assembly's Oversight Committee of the 13th of July. I would just like to welcome everybody here and also anyone who's tuning in on the webcast. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Can I just remind everybody who's present, guests and also committee members, to put your phones on silent and don't put them too near to the microphones if you've left them on vibrate, because it will pick that up. I believe we have one set of apologies for absence. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Chair. We've got one set of apologies from Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. The next item of business is the Declaration of Interests, which can be found on pages 1 to 4 of the agenda pack. Can we note the offices held by Assembly members? Thank you. And could I also ask Assembly members if they have any other disclosable pecuniary interests in any of the items that we will be discussing later on this afternoon? No? Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 3, we have the summary list of actions, which is on pages 5 to 12 in the agenda pack. Could we note the completed and the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the Oversight Committee? And I think we're doing very well at completing a number of items that are just coming to a completion at this moment in time. I can see the previous chair, Assemblymember Pigeon, is nodding at me, so that's very hopeful. We also have at agenda item 4, action taken under Delegated Authority, pages 13 to 20. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by the Chair under Delegated Authority, namely to agree in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and party group lead members a letter to the Mayor regarding the relocation of City Hall, which has been one of our outputs. Is that noted? Thank you. Which brings us swiftly on to item 5, and I can now move on to welcoming our expert guests who've joined us this afternoon. And can I thank you all for being with us. We are going to be talking about devolution for London. And normally we wouldn't set out how we would propose to do this. We would just go into our questions. I'm going to tell you now because you may want to start talking about some of the things we want to talk about later at an earlier stage. The first section of questions will be about fiscal responsibilities and issues and potential changes. The second one will be about specific areas that could be devolved or the arrangements changed. And finally, we will then talk about whether or not the London Assembly itself, whether its powers are appropriate and whether those ought to be changed. So if you can try not, when we're talking about fiscal matters, to stray into areas of responsibility or indeed issues relating to the Assembly, I would be very grateful. I'm just going to introduce our guests. We have Enver, who is the Assistant Director for Group Finance at the Greater London Authority. Thank you very much for joining us, Enver. We also have Jeremy Skinner, who I believe is going to be with us for the first couple of hours of the, hopefully we will be finished, who is the Assistant Director for City Intelligence, also at the Greater London Authority. We have Akash Paun, who is the Senior Fellow from the Institute for Government, who I think have also been looking at this area, as has the Centre for London, and you're very welcome, Claire Harding, who is the Research Director at the Centre for London. And finally, the person who had to be here this afternoon, which is Professor Tony Travers from the LSE, the London School of Economics, and who possibly may be the biggest expert on local government finance, but also on regional devolution as well. So just a small build-up, Tony, so we will expect some interesting answers from you. So we're now going to go into our questions, and we'd like to start, as I said, with fiscal devolution, and that will be a couple of questions from me, and then we'll move on to some colleagues who've got other things that they want to ask. And I'm going to start by asking this to all of you so that we can get going, and that is, what do you see as the most practical opportunity for fiscal devolution in London? And I'm going to start with Tony Travers and then work down the line.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Oversight Committee for and Assembly members for inviting me, and doubtless the rest of us here this afternoon. as many of you will be aware, and Jeremy Skinner here worked on this when I undertook this review for the former mayor, for Boris Johnson, and indeed a second version of it, the London Finance Commission 2, for the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, looked at these issues in elaborate detail, particularly in the light of the fact that Scotland and Wales, which are, after all, smaller in terms of population and GDP than London, I mean, added together, actually, smaller. And, you know, the difficulty that not only under the governments in power at the time of these two finance commissions, but actually, if you look across the whole of the period since the 1970s, when issues of this kind have been discussed, that is, devolution within England, the challenge of, not just for a devolved body of the kind the Greater London Authority is, but actually even for local government, the struggle to identify taxes that can be reasonably imagined to be available for devolution, in the way that in Scotland and Wales we've seen taxes devolved, including income tax. So it's not as if it's impossible within the UK, just very difficult in England. I'd add to that the fact that this is not made any easier, but because the two major long-term local government property taxes, that's council tax and business rates, each have substantial difficulties associated with them. Council tax has never been revalued since it was introduced in the early 1990s, and if it were, under the current arrangements, London would stand to lose quite substantially out of such a revaluation, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And then non-domestic rates, a whole array of challenges. At least they are revalued. That tax is revalued frequently and is relatively up to date at any one point. But the truth is, there are big debates, and the Treasury has held a couple of reviews of business rates as to whether they're an appropriate tax when they treat retail so differently to, say, sheds and warehousing and so on, and all of that. So, but to briefly come back to where the Finance Commission ended up, and it came up with the idea that it would be appropriate for London, and in fact for other city regional authorities in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands as they were emerging, to control the full suite of property taxes. So council tax, business rates, stamp duty, land tax, possibly even, though more difficult, elements of capital gains tax insofar as they relate to property. And the logic of that was that, A, property had been, for all of sub-national government and in many other countries, the basis of local government finance. It is in many other countries, particularly the United States, but not only there, many other countries, almost all, in fact. But separately, there was a tradition of doing it. It wasn't new. And if this full range of taxes were devolved, and by the way, we're not suggesting they were devolved and London was simply better off. Obviously, you'd offset by reducing central government funding pound for pound, so London would be neither better nor worse off, but at that point would benefit from this substantial collective of taxes, which it would then be able to modernise and reform. So it could choose, London's government could choose then to revalue the council tax, operate business rates differently, and so on, and get rid of the terrible challenge that the stamp duty land tax has, which is of making it difficult to have the property market working fully, efficiently and effectively, so it creates a barrier to people moving, particularly in London. So it would be possible for London's government to do all of that. We ensured that both the boroughs and the GLA were involved in how this would operate. And I think that as a starting point for devolution in London and, in fact, in other city regions, as I say, property taxes would be, all of them, a starting point. But actually, if Scotland and Wales can operate a local income tax, it's hard to see why, in the end, London and other city regions in England couldn't. Thank you.
Well, so that's quite a strong place to start, and quite a list of potential fiscal measures that could be devolved. Claire, is there anything that you would like to add to that? We ended on the point about local income tax, but there may be other areas that you think could be devolved, or you may completely disagree with the list that Tony Travers has just gone through. Sorry, can you turn on your microphone?
I think there's a serious risk today that you'll get an awful lot of I agree with Tony, which might get quite tedious. I think going back to your original question, Chair, there's probably a distinction to be drawn between taxes which could practically be devolved to London and kind of where the political acceptability of such a change would lie. And I think many of us have, probably almost everybody who works in public policy has felt for years that council tax is an extremely peculiar tax that works in extremely peculiar ways and is, as we all know, highly regressive, and that it makes sense, firstly, to reform it and secondly, to devolve it in order that local authorities or cities or city regions can flex to their own particular policy requirements. But we have been thinking that for about 30 years. So I'm afraid my optimism around council tax reform is low, although I think that it's impossible to overstate the case for both reform and for devolution. I think in terms of the politics, the small p politics of this, the TfL funding crisis has put us in a slightly different position over the debate about taxes in London, because of course it does seem that TfL is going to need more tax funding, at least in the short to medium term, both for revenue and for capital spending, and that may change some aspects of the debate because of the reluctance in government for that to be coming from central taxation, and that may in particular give more airtime for arguments around tax or sort of tax-related things like the MSIL, which enable London to profit from land value gains, particularly those which come about as a result of public transport investment.
Akash, feel free to disagree with Tony and Claire, or to endorse what they're saying, or introduce other areas. And as Claire has rightly pointed out, is there a practical opportunity to make any kind of changes in this way?
Sure, I fear I'm going to be more at the I agree with Tony and Claire end of that spectrum, but hopefully provide some alternative ways of looking at it. I mean, I think the general argument in favour of tax devolution and the principles that you would want to base any such devolution on have been well made by Tony just now, and of course in the reports of the LFC a few years ago. It would obviously have to be done in a revenue neutral way. Any sense that tax devolution was a way to allow London to keep a larger share of revenue at the expense of other parts of the country would be politically impossible. So that's obviously very important, and the reports of the Commission, as well as the past experience from how tax devolution to Scotland and Wales have worked, shows how you could do that. And basically it would be devolution of the incremental change in the tax take rather than full devolution of the tax base, right from the start. So yeah, I think that's important. And then obviously the reasons why you'd want to do it are so that London could vary the tax system to deal with specific local conditions, and also so you'd strengthen incentives on decision makers here in the city to follow policy that helps to build the tax take. And that's sort of the argument that you would hope eventually would be persuasive to central government, though, as Claire has said, that hasn't quite been the case so far. I mean, in terms of the specific taxes, again, I do think, it's property taxation that is most obvious as a starting point, because so obviously in the case of council tax and business rates, it is already sort of locally collected and administered, so administratively it's sort of more straightforward, and for the obvious reason that it would be a tax on immobile assets that wouldn't give rise to such concerns about people moving things around to take advantage of tax competition. So that seems like the obvious place to start, and yeah, those are things that are fully devolved to both Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland too. In terms of other things, I mean, I know that in the Commission that Tony led, there were recommendations around, I think it was more assigning a share of income tax and VAT rather than actually allowing for variable rates and so on. I think that's certainly more likely to find favour in Whitehall, but still would be a big thing for the Treasury to accept, the idea of losing control of the huge share of tax revenue that is produced by the economy in London would be difficult, and I think for some good reasons. That it would undermine the ability of the UK government to play its role as in terms of managing the economy of the UK and dealing with national and international economic shocks, and obviously redistributing money to different regions as well. But yeah, I do think there's a potential for reform. We've got examples of how that could work, and I think there's good arguments in favour of why that should be on the agenda.
Okay, I've got some more points that I want to make, but I've noticed that Assemblymember Prince wanted to come in and add something to the discussion.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for letting me in early. Tony, really, Professor Tony Travers. Tourist tax. Have you looked at tourist tax? I mean, I go to a number of big cities and pay for that.
And thanks for the prompt. In fact, the London Finance Commissions did advocate the possibility of London being able to introduce a tourism tax. In fact, we were pretty clear that what you might call powers, rather permissive powers rather than a requirement, could be introduced in legislation for the whole of England, because Edinburgh, which I realise is not in England, Edinburgh has looked at this, Bath, I think, has looked at it. And so, yes, I think we were in favour of making it possible to introduce a tourism tax, and also to consider, we did look at the question of how this could be made to work, not just for the areas in the city centre which have a very large concentration of tourism accommodation, but also, a mechanism for ensuring that outer boroughs, which had much less of an income, would at least get some sort of benefit from it. There'd have to be a sort of a way of redistributing across the city, but still allowing those areas where the greatest stress, because of heavy levels of tourism, let's hope it returns, occurred. So the answer is yes. It's a long-winded way of saying yes.
Sorry, could I just come back on that? So a couple of things there. So, clearly, I would have thought it would be best if that levy were made by City Hall, so the money came to City Hall, so they could redistribute it around London, and, as you say, a larger percentage going to the centre, but nonetheless redistribution. But also, I'd be interested to know what sort of level you would think that tourist tax would be. I think in Belgium it's about whatever they have, euros a night, and what sort of revenue that would generate.
Right. We didn't do any detailed work on this, so Jeremy may remember this better than I did, but in the sense of the yield. But Westminster City Council have done some work on it in the past. So I'm answering the questions in reverse order. I'll come back to the first one. So, I mean, if you look at what other cities levy, and as you say, Mr. Prince, many of us will have paid. It will have been. I'm always struck, particularly when you go to the United States and you think you've paid, $150 a night. Lo and behold, there's a list of taxes and rebuilding the conference centre taxes all at the bottom of it, and then sales tax on top of that. But I think that I know the tourism industry is never very enthusiastic. There are business representative members on the LFC were willing and did sign up to it. So I think you're talking about, given the, and I haven't looked at the numbers for some years, but it would be hundreds of millions of pounds, for that we can be sure. It's not pennies and halfpennies. And take Claire's point about TfL's need for long-term funding, it seems to me this would be on a list of potential ways of producing longer-term funding, which could help London, effectively subsidise public transport in the medium term, possibly the long term, to reflect the loss of travel on commuting time in particular. to answer your City Hall question, I mean, one of the things, there's two ways of answering this. The LFC very carefully, as it were, subcontracted to officials from City Hall and London councils the question of how many of these reforms would be handled on the ground, so as to keep them all on side, so that the boroughs and the mayor would be on side. I think in reality, and the pragmatic politics of this, I mean, because, as I said earlier, most of the yield from a tourism tax would come from a handful of boroughs in the city, in the middle of the city, and many other boroughs, there are almost all boroughs, and there's a separate argument as to whether outer boroughs shouldn't be promoted more for their tourism benefits, I mean, the good things to see there. But in the current situation, most of the yield will come from the centre of the city. Now, it's easier if City Hall manages it, but we were always trying to think of ensuring that both the central boroughs where most of the yield was and the outer boroughs, which often provided the workforce and had other needs of their own and might want to build up a tourism industry, that in a sense they benefited from it. So, to give you a slightly awkward answer, I think there would be good reasons for the city authority to do it, citywide authority, but ensuring that the boroughs where the bulk of the stress because of tourism comes, the need to keep the streets clean, to fund business improvement districts and so on, I think that does mean that boroughs like Westminster and Camden and Southwark and Lambeth, to name but 4, have a very powerful interest in how such a thing works.
Well, thank you. I think we've already explored something that we didn't cover off at the beginning there. It would be very interesting. One of the things we've often talked about as the Assembly in terms of funding for TfL is whether or not vehicle excise duty could be devolved to London, although those are assets that do move around, but clearly they're registered to individuals. So perhaps I'll just sort of mention that. I'm sure it's something we'll come back to. I mean, and I'm going to bring in Jeremy and Enver in a minute when we get on to some more sort of stuff about the budgeting and how we do that. What do you think the impact of devolution of the business rates and council tax could be for London? How could this benefit Londoners? And could there be any risks? I mean, obviously, we've just had this business rate pilot that we've been part of, and that's been interesting seeing how that's played out since 2016 when I was elected. And I'll start with you, Tony. Sorry.
Me, yeah. Well, I think apart from the possibility of getting London's government, and by that I mean the GLA and the boroughs, to a position where, if you look at their overall spending power and the possible yield from these taxes, you could get, even with these property taxes, pretty close to or better than, and I don't want to impinge on the discussion on the devolution of services, but given the scale of the yield of the business rates, the more modest scale of the yield of the council tax, and certainly if stamp duty land tax were added in, London could, in a sense, with the existing service responsibilities, be self-sufficient. And that would give it an enormous degree of autonomy in ordinary years, not during the COVID years, but during ordinary years. So I think that it would create that benefit. Separately, and I hinted at this earlier, these taxes need reform. And if, this is complicated stuff. In a sense, it's politically complicated nationally. If council tax, which will eventually have to have its tax base revalued, if it's done within the existing system, most of London will end up paying more, most households will, and there will be a massive redistribution of the tax burden from the rest of the country to London. Very good for levelling up in the conventional terms that it's been discussed. However, of course, because council tax, it is a regressive tax, but actually even within London, it's regressive, and separately, after 30 years plus of not revaluing the tax base, the link for many people between their incomes and the capital value of their homes is completely broken. And so one of the things of allowing London, or the West Midlands, Birmingham, or Greater Manchester, or Leeds, West Yorkshire, if they were all to do this on their own, is that, in a sense, the redistribution will be contained within the city region. Now that, of course, has implications for national. It reduces the level of resource to be redistributed if it was still a national system, but it has the enormous benefit it would make it easier to deliver a revaluation of the council tax. Business rate, as I say, the problem there isn't revaluation so much as the fact that it's no longer appropriate, particularly for medium and smaller sized businesses in London, many of which pay very large business rate bills, because the Treasury's various relief schemes for small businesses have always defined small businesses as rateable values above or below a figure. And of course, that means in many parts of the Midlands and the North, businesses have rateable values below that threshold and they get relief, whereas in London, small businesses often don't. So, tiny two-person run restaurants in London will be paying huge business rates and they don't get these kind of reliefs. So there needs to be a reform of business rates, which again, I think London, other city regions could do in a way that worked for the business structure locally and in a way that, would encourage business rather than leaving it slightly exposed to national reforms to business rate. Stamp duty, land tax, I could talk about at length. There's a lot of the yield from that in London, huge proportion of the yield, particularly in some boroughs. That would be only appropriate, I suspect, for citywide government. But if you brought them all together, you could have a much more effectively functioning property tax system, because there's no doubt at the national level, and therefore also at the London level, all of these property taxes operate in a suboptimal way.
I think there's some really interesting points there. So, Claire, in fact, in your first set of remarks, you said that council tax needs to be reformed, and obviously there is that whole issue of revaluing since 1990, which just hasn't taken place. But there's also the other issue, which is that the bans stop and don't continue. So, whether your house is worth 300,000 or 3 million or 30 million, you pay roughly the same, which also seems a bit odd. Would you agree with Tony that there's need to reform both council tax, where perhaps people are paying too little now compared to the value of their property, and business rates where, for example, in London, perhaps people are now paying too much compared to the overall return on their investment for a small business?
I would absolutely. I think, as we've said, and it would be easy just to go on and on with different examples about how these taxes operate in very peculiar and often suboptimal ways. I think it's easy to say that they need to be reformed. It's probably harder in practice to kind of define what that reformed system would look like, and how much people living in different types of properties would pay, and how different boroughs, which of course at the moment will set their own rates of council tax within that banding system, how that would work. So I think lots and lots of questions. I'm also conscious that when you have different rates of property taxation and business rates on borders, you sometimes see some quite odd effects. We see this in the US quite a lot, where they have different tax rates in different places. So, for example, in areas such as Kent or Essex, where the lines that define London often don't really match with people's lived experience, you might find some quite odd distortionary effects on the property market. I don't think those are deal breakers. I think they're potentially significant, and likewise with business rates, that it might have some. It would inevitably affect where businesses, particularly businesses which need to be located near London but not necessarily in London, such as distribution warehouses, chose to locate themselves. Again, those are not insurmountable, but I think they would be complex, and getting the exact design right would be extremely important.
Akash, I'll bring you in, and the other thing that we haven't mentioned is we talked about the unfairness of very high business rates for possibly quite small businesses that are based in London, but we haven't talked about the unfairness of actually having to pay business rates if you've got premises versus being much more of an online retailer and perhaps getting out of having to pay very much at all. Business rates needs reforming, council tax needs reforming, but how could it work if it was devolved?
I would agree that for all those reasons and more, those are two taxes long in need of reform. And I think one, if we're thinking in general about how eventually to persuade central government, which I presume you would be, that some of these things should be devolved. One argument is, I think, that it's always very difficult for central government to reform any tax system really, but it's particularly been an issue with some of these local taxes because losers in terms of demographic groups or parts of the country always shout louder and make more of a fuss politically than those who gain from reform kind of thank you, and that's a standard and well-known reason why we end up with systems that were set up and outlive their usefulness in the way that they're designed. And I think devolution actually can be quite a good way to solve that problem from a central government perspective. I mean, when you look at how, again, to go back to the devolved nations have used some of their devolved tax powers, it's quite an interesting illustration of that. I mean, Wales has gone through proper revaluation a number of years ago. They've introduced a higher band as to deal with the problem you mentioned, that the system is relatively regressive as it operates in England. They've also introduced extra bands or charges for holiday properties and second homes that could potentially be something of relevance to London. Scotland, as you may be aware, when stamp duty land tax was first devolved there, was the first part of the country to move away from the very outdated and impossible to justify slab system where the tax percentage jumped from whatever it was 2 to 5% as soon as you went £1 over the threshold, and they moved to something that's, I think, obviously more rational in terms of the percentage just applies marginally. And England and then Wales as well soon followed suit. So I think there's good examples actually of how devolution can enable experimentation and innovation in a way that central government finds difficult.
I'm not entirely sure I would agree with you that changing the tax system is difficult, because there seem to be a lot of announcements that I've been reading in the last few days from a number of individuals who are seem to be interested in a new job, who are talking extensively about some changes to the tax system.
Well, tax cuts are politically easier to sell, that's true.
But I'm going to move on to Enver and Jeremy, if I may. If there was further devolution of business rates, reformed or unreformed, let's leave that to one side, but if there was further devolution of business rates and council tax, would this provide more certainty for the mayor when we move into the annual budget setting round, and how would that benefit the ability of City Hall to deliver services?
I'll go first.
Happy to take you in any order.
It would benefit because, assuming that the powers to reform are delegated to, devolved, I should say, to the mayor, that would help us in the budget setting process to model the sensitivity around moving some of the various factors like the discounts, the reliefs, the multiplier, the business rate multiplier, all of those individual elements which are currently set nationally, they were set locally. We could model that. We could look at the elasticity of it. We could work with the boroughs. So we would cut out a lot of the uncertainty waiting for somebody to give us the information, because we could set those deadlines to the billing authorities, work closely with them, work through the year to gather that information on both council tax and business rates. And by using that modelling and that elasticity, it gives us the opportunity each year to modify it until we get to the optimum income levels and making it fairer locally. Without repeating everything that was said before. So there's a lot of benefits to giving that control over on both the business rates and the council tax. In terms of the rise at the moment, you'd have to wait for Parliament to agree what the increase in council tax would be. If that was devolved to the mayor could make decisions without waiting for Parliament to agree for specific rises.
Okay. Jeremy, would you like to add to that? And also, would you like to comment on, I referred to it earlier, we participated in the business rates devolved pilot and were part of a pool with the other boroughs across London. If you'd like to comment on whether that was successful and whether further devolution of both council tax and business rates would provide better certainty and allow services to be delivered more efficaciously.
Yes, I can touch on those perhaps in reverse order. I think Enver has explained that by having control over the tax streams, we would be better able to forecast future revenues and take borrowing decisions within the Prudential Code. And with regard to that comment, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves of the context in which the original LFC was written, which was in 2013, a period of very strong population and economic growth for the capital. And we couched the overall recommendations for devolution of those taxes to support London in its growth. In 2017, coming out of the Brexit vote, the argument was a little bit different. It was more about how can we still retain London's global positioning, and given that central government would have a rather big job to do to get Brexit done, there was a strong feeling that City Hall should be well placed to deliver the local services alongside the boroughs, and that fiscal devolution was an important component of providing us with certainty in a very uncertain overall context. And if we now think about the context today as we come out of the pandemic, and our government's arguments for levelling up, not levelling down, but levelling up, there's an implication that all parties agree that London should continue to grow and prosper and continue to support the rest of the country in levelling up. So we kind of revert back to some of the original arguments of LFC 1, that we still need that much bigger, stable tax base against which we can borrow to invest in infrastructure, housing, and to address the inequalities that were so starkly shown up by the pandemic. So in those contexts, certainly having property taxes and the ability to reform them is important, but it's also to provide us with that investment base. Going back to your original question about what's the most practical, well, assignment of some of the national taxes perhaps might be the most straightforward and easiest, even if it might be the most difficult for Treasury to consider. But it's really quite a straightforward and simple calculation. And if we look at many of the levelling up and similar funds that have been given to London, the government recently published a detailed list of 12 funds that have been delegated. London received approximately £680 million. A thought experiment suggests that if you just switched off all that grant funding and switched on an assignment of a similar amount of national taxation, it may lead to very different forms of decision making in this building and within the boroughs. Hopefully that would be more efficient because we're closer to where services are actually delivered in the capital. So those are some thoughts. And just to refer to some of the previous comments, we did do some modelling of the stamp duty, land tax, and Tony's right. We were looking at sort of high tens, low hundreds of millions of pounds. Not a vast amount, but again, if you think about the stability of that sort of tax, notwithstanding a pandemic, a very helpful tax base against which to borrow to invest. In terms of the business rate pool, I think it enabled us, as far as I recollect, to develop schemes in digital connectivity, for instance, that covered the whole of London. And with the boroughs, we were able to craft a portfolio of investment that we could demonstrate were touching all parts of the city and addressing, genuine economic development needs in the capital. So I think it was a worthy experiment, and one which hopefully, under a more devolved world, we can return to in future.
Akash, you wanted to come in, and then I'm going to pass on to a colleague.
If I might, just briefly on assignment, and Jeremy and others may have answers that I'm unaware of to these questions, but I think it's assignment of a share of some of those national taxes is an attractive model in principle, but I think there are some quite technically complicated aspects of it. I mean, if you look at, so VAT assignation to Scotland was agreed 5-6 years ago. It still hasn't been implemented because they've been unable to agree between the Scottish and UK governments how you calculate, or actually how you estimate, what share of a company's VAT revenue is collected in Scotland. I think that would be even harder to do in London because, you know, so many companies operate partly in London and partly in other parts of the country. So I think that would be quite hard, actually. I mean, income tax, HMRC has shown that it can be done by basically, you know, just identifying people as Scottish or Welsh taxpayers based on their residence. The complication with London would presumably be the large number of people who commute in from outside London, who therefore, based on that model, would not be London income taxpayers, even though their jobs were in London. And so the incentives wouldn't necessarily align in terms of, you might be creating jobs in London, but then the extra revenue wouldn't come to GLA. So I just note that.
Thank you. I understand there's some complexities that have just resulted from last year's census, because a lot of people with second homes were on the 21st of March not in London, but were in North Norfolk and the Cotswolds and other sundry places. So I think that probably speaks to the point that you've just made, and it's just so that will be a complication in the census. However, I am now going to pass on to my colleague, Dr. Onka Sahota, who is going to continue with some questions.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for you, Tony, and it's about, does the replacement of Section 106 and SIL with a new infrastructure levy as proposed by the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill provide any opportunities for London?
Well, as I understand it, the proposal is to replace community infrastructure levy with an infrastructure levy, but with the government having slightly more say in level, if not, I mean, the yield would still be available, but the government would have greater control over the way the levels are set, or the level is set. I think Section 106 will continue to exist for large schemes, if I understand it correctly. So, as ever with Section 106, it's abolished, but never abolished. If you see, it's the second time it hasn't been abolished. And there is a particular concern, which I'm not as on top on as others will be, about the way in which Section 106 in particular funded social and affordable housing and could be ring-fenced for that purpose, whereas infrastructure levy, if it's to be like the community infrastructure levy, will simply be available for authorities to use as they will. Now, I've heard the former Levelling Up Secretary of State, Michael Gove, make the point that London and the South East had substantial yields and have always had substantial yields from Section 106 and SIL, and we would expect them, unless there's a radical reordering of the UK economy, to continue to be the parts of the country that raise most money from those sources, giving a degree of autonomy to London boroughs and to City Hall, whereas, particularly the boroughs, whereas in the rest of the country, targeted regeneration funding will be used instead of that money. So that's an element in the Levelling Up debate. So, you know, it's hard to be certain at the moment exactly how it will work and how it will differ. And there is an issue which has been raised in Parliament as to whether, because of the heavy concentration of yield in London and the South East, it would be fairer to equalise between the yield from infrastructure levy in London and the rest of the country. And of course, once you do that, you're, as you are with council tax and the business rate, in a position where London has to, where it takes development, but if it happens, some of the resource would be taken away from London. Now, I think given the difficulty of getting developments agreed with in many places, that would make them even more difficult to get through, I think. So until we have all the fine details and, you know, the government determines exactly how it's going to operate, I'm not sure it's possible to give an absolute and clear answer. All I'd say is it's not going to be radically different, I suspect, to the earlier arrangements, save this qualification about there's less certainty about ring-fencing resources for social and affordable housing.
Do you think that the new type of land value capture tax would be an alternative way of looking at this problem?
Well, I think so long as property values in London, and particularly in inner and central London, though not only there, in some of the town centres in outer London, are high by national standards, it's going to be easier for London to use infrastructure levy, land value capture type mechanisms. And indeed, I was going to add this point to the previous discussion after some of the other contributions. One of the problems we have in London with the council tax and business rate arrangements, which are not problems with SIL and Section 106, is that the borough or city hall making a decision about planning permissions and so on broadly knows what it's going to get in from these sources. With council tax and business rates, at the moment, however much development goes on in London, you can't be certain whether you're a borough or city hall, how much you'll get from it. That'd be very different in America. In the United States, in New York, if the city changes the zoning rules, then the city keeps all the money that comes in from those changes. And you get very substantial amounts of money coming in from these new pencil towers that have had so much coverage in the press in recent weeks. They pay huge amounts in property tax to the city, which it knows it will get when it changes the zoning arrangements. Whereas if a borough or the mayor change planning in London, you can't really predict whether you'll get any more money or not through council tax or business rates. But you could through the infrastructure levy and currently Section 106. So I think there's a link between this issue and giving councils and City Hall an incentive to link planning decisions to the yield of taxes.
If I may, I'd just like to develop a few of the points about housing a little bit further. I think I'm worried about affordable housing at the moment. I'm sure many others are as well, because of this combination of the threat to S106 and SIL money with the change to the 80-20 rule, which was announced at the very start of February this year. It's quite hard to see how those are going to play out in practice. You know, they're formulas that are slightly mysterious in the way that they work. House building funding allocation, but it seems that it is going to become harder. So I guess that's sort of worry about how the different parts of the system mesh together. On Tony's point about business rates and council tax and development, of course, the other issue with those, as opposed to other means of property taxation, is that people don't start paying them until they've moved in, which, you know, when we're talking about kind of the staging and the management of building processes, a lot of the inconvenience to residents and the point at which people are often very annoyed indeed is not when people have moved in, it's during the building process. So systems which say, well, you can only get extra money once that building process is complete, have issues compared to the sort of New York type model, where I'm no expert, but as I understand it, the money starts to flow somewhat earlier in the development process.
Great. And the other thing, did you want to come in, Akash?
Well, I was just going to make a different kind of point, because I'm far from being an expert on those specific mechanisms, but which is just that many of these debates around, for example, potential for sort of land value capture mechanisms are taking place in as part of devolution negotiations in other parts of England as well. And you know, as the committee will be well aware, Greater Manchester and West Midlands are due to be negotiating new devolution deals, trailblazer deals, and other places as well are looking into this as well. So it just strikes me, and I could probably make this point at other points in the discussion as well, but this might be a good area where there's potential for London to build a coalition with other cities and other devolved institutions. I mean, both to make the case to government for reform, but also to maybe share capacity to work up a kind of alternative model that could be implemented.
Okay, thanks. And just one more thing is that land values, for example, do change. For example, we've had the Elizabeth Line move, and the land values in Woolwich have gone up. How can we use those increase in land values to make investment in infrastructure? How can we harness those land value increases?
I'll say what I know about this committee. So, as you say, land values are changing all the time, and if land values are increasing as a result of some public investment, often in public transport, then there is at least an argument that some of that incremental increase in land value should be retained in some form of taxation to help repay the borrowing necessary to build that infrastructure in the first place. So it's a sort of one form of tax increment financing. And we have examples of that in the city with the construction of the Northern Line extension in Battersea, funded by the business rates uplift in Vauxhall Line, Elmsford, Battersea. And you could argue at an even grander scale, the business rate supplement is a form of land value capture for existing properties as well as new properties to help fund the borrowing required for Crossrail. But most of the incremental tax that we can get is in the commercial sector through business rates, yet increasingly most of the value that I think is being created and is required and is necessary is in housing. Housing, when I re-looked at the business case for Crossrail 1, amazingly housing barely featured at all in the business case for Crossrail 1, which we were successful in winning the argument with government. It is very hard to think of any transport business case being developed in the city or in other conurbations now without housing being a predominant element. And housing is not traditionally thought of by economists as a contribution to the overall economy, and yet I think in London we've known for some time that it's a massive constraint on economic growth. The problem then is, how do you capture the increase in residential values from creating new transport investment? We don't charge capital gains on people's main properties. At the most, we get some tax back through inheritance tax at the end of someone's life, but that's obviously very uncertain, fortunately. And stamp duty, land tax, as we've discussed before, is quite lumpy. When TfL looked at this in 2017, we put forward an argument for something called a transport premium charge that in the zones of influence around new transport hubs, there could be an argument for a charge on residences for new occupiers or new renters, not necessarily paid immediately. It could be a charge on their properties when they sell or move on, as one way of providing a relatively stable, predictable source of income against which you could borrow to invest. So we've explored some of these ideas with the Treasury and others, but rather like the tourism tax, we haven't had that much traction so far.
Thank you. I'm just going to come to Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon, who had indicated she wanted to come in earlier, and I've unfortunately confused CP with KP on my sheet.
Okay, don't worry. Thank you very much. Tony, perhaps I could ask you, because it's a really interesting discussion, but as we know, virtually all taxation in the UK is centralised and determined by central government. But when you look internationally, you're looking at models of local and regional government funding. Places, France, Belgium, Japan, show that you can devolve more taxation locally and encourage growth and good levels of funding for public services. So do you think the government is too cautious in this area? And, which models should we be looking at as good examples to compare London to?
I mean, it's definitely true, and the LFC figures we published in the London Finance Commission showed this, but actually the OECD's annual revenue statistics will show it even more up to date. the UK, for a large country, is a spectacular outlier, certainly England within the UK, in terms of the, and 95% of all taxes in Britain are set by UK central government, and the 5% that isn't is council tax, which is capped anyway, so on some definitions it's 100%. This is an extraordinary position that successive governments have allowed to emerge. And so we are an outlier, and almost, why are UK governments impervious to the rational arguments of decent people who make this point? Lo and behold, nothing ever changes. Now, it's partly because there is mistrust in the Treasury, serious mistrust about anybody controlling the total of public expenditure and individual taxes other than them. Treasury do good things, but they don't do everything right, so that's one problem. I think second, in many ways, local government has been less demanding, subnational government in England, so all levels, less demanding of powers to have more finance raised locally than one might have expected. There's a sort of comfort level of being able to blame central government for there not being enough money for everything. Okay? And if more money were raised locally, it would be much more difficult, or a higher proportion, I should say, of the total of spending were funded from local sources, far more difficult to blame ministers for things that didn't go right. So, I think there's a sort of theoretical academic. Some politicians love the idea of more devolution, particularly of financial, tax-raising powers, and I do personally. But it comes to a pretty pass when countries like France, which used to be an object lesson in centralisation, have more local taxation raised at the subnational level than we do in the United Kingdom, and more autonomy at the subnational level as a result of that. So I think there's a bigger question which only politicians, dare I say, can answer at this level and your colleagues at the national level, which is why they do find it so difficult to make this change when, very interesting figures published by the Office for National Statistics yesterday, or maybe today, about trust in government. Because people trust local, subnational government more than they trust national government. We've seen these figures before. And if you devolve more decision-making, we'll come on to this again, I'm sure, with devolution of services, liberal democracy as a whole would be stronger. There is a challenge to liberal democracy, but if more decisions, more tax raising went on at a subnational level, it would be nearer where people felt they controlled it, and they'd feel greater trust in democracy. And that seems to me a bigger prize today than ever before.
Yeah, absolutely. So democracy and devolution of finance kind of go hand in hand. I agree with that. I'm interested, the government's levelling up white paper, when you look at it, it does make a commitment to, let me quote, significantly increase devolved revenue raising powers. But obviously none of us are particularly clear what that would mean. Have you any idea what the thinking is that sits behind this? Is there suddenly going to be some revolution here, or is this something very timid and, of course, London may lose out?
Well, I was heartened by it, and particularly because the then Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, was somebody who I thought had a real command of and understand how to use a department and how to set public policy. Not making a political remark, I think most people would agree with that. So the fact that he believed it and it was in the white paper gave me hope that as the debate about levelling on moved on and city regions in the Midlands and the North lobbied the same case, that there would be a slightly greater chance of delivering it than had happened hitherto. But that was then and this is now. But all I'd say is this: I think, Northern and Midland city leaders, I think, are absolutely clear, and I agree with them, that unless there is devolution of powers and resources to them, levelling up won't work. And why should we disagree with them in London? If they say that, why should we disagree with them? And if it's true there, it's going to be true in London as well.
So you think that behind that is that lobbying from those metro mayors, if I can use that phrase, and that's perhaps what the thinking was about.
Well, in exactly the same way that in the early years of this Assembly and the Mayor in 2000, 2001, 2003, when the government of the day had set it up and it needed to look as if it worked, lo and behold, London got lots of money and help. It wasn't always that easy, but, worked reasonably well. At the moment, the government is committed to levelling up, and as part of that, devolving powers not just to the existing combined authorities, but to new county ones as well. And many of the elected representatives there strongly believe in what the issue we're discussing. So, as it's the government, I mean, all of this is up in the air. I don't want to get involved in all of that, but the way the country is governed and who does it from now on, and their commitment to levelling up, because levelling up's a non-party political issue, isn't it? There's not a political party in Britain that doesn't believe in levelling up. It's a consensus party. The question is, how far will political leaders at the national level be willing to pressurise the Treasury and other departments to give up some power in order to make the country better governed and make levelling up work?
Okay.
So I know you're supposed to ask us questions, but it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune wanted to come in as well.
Thanks very much. I just really agree with that last point, and I think that's where we got to in the first meeting, that the complexities around taxation, how you spread that around, how you measure everything, whilst that is challenging, the real challenging aspect here is the trust. And there is a comfort blanket for local and subnational government of all political stripes to be able to blame national government. And that's probably why you get that trust imbalance as well. But going back to the land value capture tax, Jeremy, you worked on this. And so I know you were explaining just now that it hadn't gone to the full extent of its thinking, but I thought this was really interesting. What was the thinking around capturing the tax? Because would there be a lag on getting that money through as well?
There would be a lag, but as long as I say, the tax could be, guaranteed through legislation and predictable through good financial modelling, then that would provide a secure revenue stream against which you could borrow to invest. But this is work that was done almost as an adjunct to the work of the London Finance Commission that was led by Transport for London, and we can send you the reports, Peter.
I'm going to go back and read the LFC 1
sure.
and
it's one
2,
of the working papers that accompanies.
Because one of the things that I wondered with that was, would that quantum shift over time? So let's say you put a charge on a property and that property wasn't sold or didn't pass on for 20 years. Would the amount of value you would claw back increase over time as well?
I seem to remember that the sort of design of the tax would be an annual charge.
Right.
If you've struggled to pay, then I think we were considering an option of rolling up the charge over time and then payable at the point where the property passed hands. But we hadn't got into the really quite detailed design tax issues at that point.
Because I think the last thing that when I sort of read and I only had a sort of dilettante understanding of it, was a couple of years back when I had more hair and less waste. It was my job to try and get schools built in a local authority, and the pressure, even though the houses around it, and one of the arguments we would make is your house value is going to go up, they would campaign aggressively against it. So now you've got a double whammy of actually forcing through a planning decision, or trying to force through a planning decision, which is good for local infrastructure, with the local people opposing it, and then getting a tax added at the end of it. I can see real challenges with getting that through.
Certainly, and again, the options would be around whether you would have different rates for existing property owners. I think the original report said 0 rate for existing property owners. It would only be for the newcomers who would be could choose whether or not to move in next door to the transport station, or in your case, the new school.
That comes back to what Claire was saying earlier, that actually...
But obviously you get less money.
Yeah, and you don't have any kind of security about the amount of money that's coming in either, so there's still an element of gamble there. I'll leave it there, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, thank you. The mayors across the country do actually lobby together, as I think all of you know, was part of the M10 group. I know they've been lobbying for devolution. So I think there was obviously, I'm assuming, quite a lot of disappointment in the levelling up white paper. So, and it seems that from that white paper, that actually the government's aim is to develop a simplified long-term funding settlement. And so my question, I'm going to start with Akash, if I can, is that I suppose, assuming we're not going to get devolution, how should we get government money? At the moment, we've got various pots that comes down to us that can be confusing. It's not flexible. They're often ring-fenced. And as we've heard from Jeremy, you know, there's no great long-term security in that. So, Akash, I'm interested in your views about whether a single mayoral settlement over a number of years or a settlement similar to the mayoral combined authorities, investment funds, which one would be better for London, and what would be the benefits or disbenefits of having that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is a really important area, and you said, you know, there were sort of mixed views about the levelling up white paper proposals overall, but I think the commitment to funding simplification, the recognition by ministers, and in particular, again, Michael Gove as the champion of this agenda, that the current funding landscape for subnational government of various kinds is horrifically overcomplicated, fragmented, doesn't allow for the kind of joining up and innovation locally that, in a way, is the whole argument behind why devolution should deliver better outcomes. Is, you know, that's a problem that needs fixing. That was very welcome to see. In our recent research that you may or may not have seen on specifically on metro mayors, we didn't look at London particularly or directly. It came through as an absolute common concern in all the places and all the people we spoke to, that there were multiple streams of funding from various Whitehall departments. We heard numbers given of over 100, maybe even over 200 different funding streams that individual mayoral combined authorities were able to identify. With various kinds of accountability arrangements back to Whitehall, with funding provided on different time horizons, all sorts of complexity like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think any progress one can make towards rationalisation of that would be a win from this agenda. There's different ways you could do it. I mean, certainly if you listen to the likes of Andy Burnham, who's always shooting for the stars on this stuff, I would say, he would argue that the destination should be something like a Scottish-Welsh-style block grant, in which essentially all these dozens of funding streams are put into a single pot. Maybe you'd probably have to have a division between capital and current spending. You might have to have reviews every 5 years to make sure that the Treasury was satisfied the money was being used to achieve the kind of outcomes it's looking for. But that kind of radically simplified and devolved model is one possible destination. It's quite a long way from where we are now, obviously, and if you were to go down that path, I think there's going to be a lot of thought need to be given to scrutiny and accountability arrangements as well, because it's easy to say, oh, look at Scottish block grant. Well, there's a Scottish Parliament whose whole job is to hold to account the Scottish Government and the use of that money. In London, there's obviously the Assembly, who have a scrutiny role to play. In the mayoral combined authorities, it's recognised to be a big sort of weak point in the system, that the lack of such a strong and visible scrutiny mechanism. So, short answer, I don't think we're going to get to that radical change anytime soon, but it's good to have that as a potential endpoint. What I think you could do in the short to medium term is have joined up pots of money for around particular policy areas. So, for example, in the way, as you say, there's a sort of infrastructure investment fund you could do similar for skills. Instead of having a dozen or whatever different skills budgets, why couldn't an MCA or indeed the GLA have guaranteed long-term skills pots that can then be used flexibly to and be reallocated in line with local economic conditions, with accountability then for outcomes? Can you show that you're using that money to get people into jobs or to get people into higher skilled jobs rather than what we've got at the moment, which is accountability for outputs and specific deliverables? And you could apply something similar, I think, to net zero funding, to housing funding as well. So I think that's the sort of direction that I would like to see us move in.
I don't know whether Claire or Tony have any comments on that.
One of the most disappointing things was that it talked at some length about the difficulties of short-term bidding in for funding pots, and then reaches this rather peculiar conclusion that maybe we ought to do a little bit less of it. It doesn't necessarily follow its own logic. I think making the sort of change that Akash has just described, to large-scale kind of funding pot determination at city level or regional level is absolutely desirable. It requires a big rethink to the way that Whitehall thinks about measuring the impact and effectiveness of its spending. I'm sure maybe others here as well have worked with voluntary organisations where you're hauled up in front of a civil servant for your 30 grand a year and required to explain in great detail what you've done with it, and then only after that, and only after you've put all your staff on notice of redundancy, do they decide whether they're going to give you another 30 grand next year. So I think if we're going to do this, it probably needs to go hand in hand with a really good rethink of how we manage funding pots, not just at government level, but also to delivery providers, and how we do impact measurement and how we require people to be accountable. To be absolutely honest, my job wouldn't have been a great deal easier, apart from that, but the journey would have been shorter if I'd had to go and have those conversations at the GLA about my 30 grand a year. What would have been transformative to my organisation's, my then organisation's ability to make a difference was knowing we had it for 3 years and being able to have a bit more flexibility about how we defined outcomes rather than outputs.
I'd add to what's been said and to build on it really, is that for the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government, the Barnett formula is a really cool advantage. Because the money just comes in. The UK government sets total spending for England, and that then flows into Scotland and Wales just pro rata, adjusted for population. And that gives them a profoundly more certain environment than any subnational unit of government in England, which is always beholden to the government of the day to lobby for more money or to try to get it. And you end up with the funding pots and all the other stuff. So what the Barnett formula is for and of itself, not a brilliant idea, because it's never, Wales and Scotland have never had their needs relative to England or English regions' needs measured and then sort of equalised. But it does give the Scottish and Welsh governments an extraordinary degree of capacity to plan, because they can never do worse or better, but never worse than the UK government total spend in England, and that does give them a degree of security.
Thank you. Can I then just finally ask either Jeremy or Enver, if you were to get, I suppose, less funding streams but bigger pots with more flexibility, would that be of benefit? I'm assuming it would be. But is it something you're actively lobbying for, or the Mayor is lobbying for?
I'd like to sort of take the question up a level first and bring it back down, because I think we're talking about those pots, but initially how I understood the question was, what if we replaced what the Mayor gets by a single departmental delegation? Or are we saying, you keep your business rates and your council tax as is, the police grant carries on coming in, the fire grant carries on, And this is the other little bit, the bits you're getting through all these different pots. So if the question is about the extra bits that we get, of course it would be easy just to get that as a single pot and give the mayor devolved authority to decide how that's allocated. But if we were talking about replacing everything, as government departments get, and we get the equivalent of the GLA pot, that would be a complete different picture. Now, would you like me to answer that one, or the smaller pot?
Yeah.
If we got a single departmental settlement, I'll give you some advantages and I'll give you some disadvantages, because having been in the civil service and negotiated the departmental DELs, there are disadvantages too. The advantage would be that you get a single figure, you get your certainty going into the future. You deal with one single department in that pot. You get the delegation within certain votes around how you can spend that money. You get your capital allocation and your revenue allocation, and you can almost do away with capital receipts and borrowing because you're getting that sum of money. So you get a comfort, you get a certain knowledge. What you don't always get, though, is the negotiation to apply for growth. Who are you negotiating with? Because when you look at a cross-multidisciplinary organisation like the GLA group is, it doesn't all come under Dulux, it doesn't all come under DFT, it doesn't all come under Home Office. So the common place where it all comes together is the Treasury. But where does the outcomes that the GLA then is trying to achieve, how does that get supported at the highest political level if you're not going through your sort of sponsor department? Because who's backing each of those outcomes that you're trying to spend the money on? So there is a disadvantage to having to go directly to Treasury to offset against some of the advantages, because we're not a government department, so what's the link to having that bidding round every year or every 4 years? And if it doesn't go in our favour, we're stuck with it for 4 years. So that certainty could be a bad certainty. It could be you're certain that you're not going to get what you need for 4 years. And I think it's about, if you did get it, what level of autonomy would the mayor get? Because would each element within that single departmental limit be hypothecated? Would it say you have to spend this much on transport, this much on police, this much on education, this much on housing? And once it's done that, what's left for the mayor's discretion? So although it sounds like it's great, it could it's almost the opposite of devolution, because it could take away some of the freedoms. So a lot depends on what are the strings attached to that single departmental limit. And I just don't see a world where we would just be given a pot of money and say, off you go, do what you want with it. So for that reason, I wouldn't necessarily be in favour of that. But if it was going back to the earlier part of the question, which is all these little pots that we get,
simplification, yeah.
Could we just have some of that and give the mayor the discretion? I'd say that is a good thing. It's much more simpler.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you. I think we're going to move on now in terms of moving away from the fiscal. Did you want to come in? Yes, sorry. Assembly Member Duval.
Just very quickly, in terms of the changing from the old rating system to the new council tax, it was almost a crisis in coming, to be honest. It needed to change and things needed to happen. Of course, the business rates, Tony, that you alluded to is uprated and continues to function and deliver in terms from a government point of view, but everyone complains about it, or the level of it around that. What's the crisis then that's going to bring about this change through the proposals that we all think around this table, I think, are sensible, but no one in power does?
Well, as with the decline in duty relating to fuel for vehicles, which is going to go away because of electric vehicles, that will be a crisis that will force the government to think about how it... I mean, but the difficulty implied by your question is that, of course, one of the reasons the Treasury doesn't want to change the business rate yield is that it brings in, other than during the years of COVID, a nice stable 30+ billion a year, which councils are quite good at collecting, and lo and behold, it works. Council tax, even more so. Council tax was, to show you how robust it is, there were only 2 taxes whose yield increased during 2020-21. One was council tax, the other was alcohol duty. And it just shows you why the Treasury is so relaxed, really, because it's bringing in this huge, they're each bringing in huge slabs of money. So the crisis isn't going to be one of, as with, you know, the changes in the amount coming in from excise and other duties to do with sales of petrol and other fuels. It's not going to be that. It will have to be that now with council tax. I mean, 30+ years without a revaluation, 40, 50, 60. I mean, at some point, the patent absurdity of it will get the better of it. Business rates, I definitely think it has to, something to do with the lobbying of businesses, particularly retail, given the amount of effort that all political parties believe should be put into improving high streets. Nobody dislikes high streets. There's no question that those operating shops in high streets end up, or any kind of business in a high street with a shop window, end up paying far more in business rates than, as we heard earlier, online businesses or those in warehouses. So those are the kind of issues that will eventually force change, but they are slow boil ones rather than sudden ones. So that's not much of an answer, it's a description.
Claire or Akash, have you got any viewpoints?
As you say, I think, you know, it's felt like a failing system for years, and we're faced with this absurdity of trying to guess how much newly built houses would have been worth in 1990, which, you know, is just, I think, one of the most bizarre aspects of the British tax system. And I think that, might be a point where the logic starts to collapse if, and this is not in any way a prediction, we do start to see rapid changes to house prices. That might become kind of an additional level of complication that just draws attention to what is already a very silly aspect of this tax. As I said before, I think the ongoing discussions about Transport for London, which I'm sure you have had many separate hearings about, might force a rethink about sort of tax devolution more generally. And as Tony and others have said, council tax is in some ways one of the easier ones to do there. I think there are serious, as Assembly members have alluded to, serious disadvantages to doing that, because of course many of the people who benefit from Transport for London do not live in London, and many people who do live in London, and indeed many of the people who are struggling the most with their finances at present, do not make much use of public transport, or if they do, they use buses rather than the more expensive tubes. So I think there are always equity impacts to any of these changes, but I think it would be very foolish to try to put a date on the end of council tax. I think that date has been predicted by many people wiser than me.
I would just quickly add, I mean, I'd like to think that, as Tony's put it at some point, I think your phrase, the patent absurdity of the system just becomes too hard an argument to resist. But in the end, you know, this is never going to be an easy nettle for any government to grasp. It's always going to cause political pain. There's always going to be, as to go back to a point I made before, lots of losers from any reform. Unless there's a wholesale reduction in rates, in revenue, there's going to be losers shouting loudly in marginal seats and so on. So at what point does it happen? Presumably a strong incoming Prime Minister or government with a clear commitment to it, who has a strong enough manifesto, a majority in Parliament and political will to see it through. Who knows when that point may be reached.
Okay, thank you. That was an interesting addition. Colleagues, I'm just going to point out that we are lagging slightly behind in terms of our expectation of where we might have been in the questioning, and that's because the questions and the answers have been very interesting. But I am going to have to ask you, if you can all, to pick up the pace for the last two sections a little bit. And I'm now going to move on to Assembly Member Best, who's going to commence on the other areas of devolution. So this is moving away from the fiscal areas to, what areas of functionality could be devolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. But just unfortunately, sorry to step back a second, because when Assemblymember McCartney asked a question about what representations the Mayor had made on fiscal devolution, I might have had this wrong, but Jeremy, you seemed to nod as though you were going to come in at that point and then didn't. So we didn't actually get an answer on that part of Assemblymember's question.
So the Mayor and officials and Deputy Mayors and others have made many representations to government on fiscal devolution. Tony will remember that we had two meetings with the Treasury shortly after LFC 2 under this mayoralty, and I know that the Mayor has had a number of discussions with the Secretary of State for Levelling Up about prospects for further devolution. And obviously, there have been discussions on the devolution white paper and more recently on the bill. So I think we could say countless number. I would also say, though, that whereas perhaps in the early 2010s we had some more systematic discussions with government, for instance, around London's infrastructure needs and delegating business rates, there has been less of that sort of high-level discussion, particularly with the Treasury in recent years, which is a great shame. Going back to some of the early points, I think sort of normal, stable government might help to lead us on to discussing some of the reforms that I think everyone around this table agree are required.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm guessing that Vicky is online. Yes, I can see it popping
Yes,
now.
I should have pointed out that Vicky Hobart will be joining the meeting at this point virtually, and she's the Director of Public Health at the GLA. Thank you, Vicky, for being with us.
Thank you.
Hi, Vicky. I was going to come to you first to ask what has been the impact of the 2017 London Health and Care Devolution Agreement and Memorandum of Understanding?
Councillor Best. So just to put in context the devolution journey that we've been on in London around health and care. So 2007 GLA Act built in the requirement for the Mayor to develop a health inequality strategy for London. And the Mayor's precluded from commissioning health and care services in London, but has this duty around bringing partners together around the health inequality strategy. We then saw the transition of public health services from the NHS into local authorities. And although we still have things like NICE guidance and the consolidated evidence base, arguably that brought in a little bit more devolution of some of the decision making around public health strategy at the local level, led by local government. 2016, the lead up to that, the MOU that you're referring to, Councillor Best, we had 5 pilots ongoing in London that were looking at the future of integration in London, in looking at both vertical and horizontal integration. So vertical within the NHS between hospitals, primary care, community mental health services, as well as kind of horizontally across the local government, social care and public health services. And really it was that I was involved in the Barking, Havering, Redbridge one, as you may remember, and a lot of kind of rich learning came out of that at the time from different parts of London, bearing in mind that London's also always operated on this kind of radial system out from the teaching hospital. So the devolution agreement really consolidated some discussions with the Treasury at the time around, at a fairly granular level, around estates and the use of capital receipts. And it was linked at the time to the One Public Estate programme and some of the conversations that were being led by public sector organisations for their localities. And that work's been taken forward through the London Estates Board. We now have the London Estates Delivery Units, which is hosted within Housing and Land within the GLA, and is spotting kind of the opportunities that are coming up as the NHS develops its estates plans. And we would expect, as the integrated care systems, which have now come into being, They're developing their kind of strategies by the end of the financial year. Again, that will continue with that momentum. It was also looking at integration and transformation funding at the time. Again, that has moved forward a lot, and I'll come back to the vision that was developed in London. It was a focus on workforce and skills, and then the fourth area was around prevention of ill health. So what we're trying to address, I guess, if we're looking at what differences it made to the health of Londoners, we are stepping back from this. The King's Fund have quite a helpful framework to sort of think about the types of action that improve health, given that only 10 to 20% of the health of Londoners comes from the health service, from the NHS. So we're generally thinking about how the health and care system is operating. We're thinking about the behaviours and lifestyles, particularly Londoners that may require support with addictions, being more active in their daily lives, etc. Third area we're thinking about is the places and the communities they're living in. And the fourth area would be around the wider determinants of health. So the MOU, going back to the Health and Care Memorandum of Understanding around devolution, picked out a few areas of prevention of ill health where London strategic partners are very keen to explore. One would be around high fat, salt, sugar advertising, fast food takeaway proliferation, particularly around schools, fixed odds betting terminals in high street betting shops, and a whole range of kind of strategic work around childhood obesity. And a number of those have been brought forward in a number of ways over time. Maybe less progress on the work on fixed odds betting terminals, because some of that work was picked up nationally. So there has been success there. Going back to the sort of timeline, so coming out of the Devolution MOU, 2018 Health and Equality Strategy was developed and agreed with partners, and a number of the commitments were picked up and given additional momentum there. And then 2019, the Health and Care Vision for London was developed, which was looking at where had we got to with estates, workforce, digital and integration conversations, but also what were the outcomes, the specific outcomes where the health and care system felt there was value in enhanced collaboration around those outcomes, and 10 outcomes were developed as part of that. And the London Health Board has been kind of shepherding and hosting forward conversations across that partnership for those vision priorities. Maybe I'll pause there for now, and then we can talk about COVID and so on if that comes up later.
Thanks. And you have to forgive me, Vicky, but I couldn't hear some of what you were saying. I don't know if it was a sound issue, but it felt fairly muffled. But I think I got the gist of most of it. In that devolution agreement, one of the main aspects was to make sure that London was involved in all decisions. Do you think that's been helpful, and do you think that that is correct, that London is involved in all those decisions?
Decisions regarding
all the key elements within the MOU.
So the various parts, I mean, the governance of the MOU, I think the devolution agreement this was part of, I think there was a change in Chancellor shortly afterwards. There were clearly changes in how some of those elements with national government were maintained. From a London perspective, the organisations that were signatories to this, and that would include Public Health England, who had conversations with various kind of colleagues around some of the prevention elements, the Estates Board, there's been ongoing conversations with the relevant government departments, etc. So yes, but as an MOU itself, the MOU didn't, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this area, didn't retain its kind of integrity as an agreement, where that has been kind of followed through the central government.
Thanks. Akash, if I could come to you quickly. What lessons can London take from Manchester's approach to health and social care devolution?
So a lot. Oh, sorry.
Shall I answer first? I mean, I'm very interested to hear from Vicky as well, who I'm sure knows more about it than I do, actually. I mean, the Greater Manchester health and social care devolution model it's an interesting experiment. I mean, it's notable actually that outside of Greater Manchester, this has not been an area that I think most of the metro mayors have pursued. Most of them are far more concerned about getting further powers in areas we'll probably come on to talk about in a while, relating to economic growth and job creation and so on. I mean, Andy Burnham and Greater Manchester Combined Authority a bit of an exception, I think, in that respect, and there is this sense of Greater Manchester becoming a responsible body for a wider set of public services. I mean, in terms of what I know from the Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership that was set up, I think, in 2016, so it preceded the mayor. It was an agreement between government, obviously NHS, and the 10 local authorities in the Greater Manchester region. So it was local government led rather than regional, because there wasn't the mayor at that point, but the councils were working together anyway. And yeah, there was sort of £6 billion budget. Devolved, a big focus on health and social care integration, and many of the themes I think that Vicky's been talking about, preventative measures, focus on sort of population health and health inequalities, and also trying to integrate with other functions where there's a devolved responsibility, such as policing and I suppose early children's services and so on as well. I mean, from what I've seen from some of the assessments of it, it's a bit early to say whether it's really started to generate the differences in terms of outcomes. People in Greater Manchester would no doubt be able to point to the evidence of what they've been able to change. But I think it's a model that it's a long way away from full devolution, of course. I mean, many people, I think, would argue that it's more like administrative delegation, but what it clearly does allow is a partnership-based approach at that place-based level, which absolutely involves the local leaders, local authorities and other public service people in designing the strategy and trying to spot the overlaps between health and other outcomes. But yeah, Vicky, I'm very interested in your thoughts, obviously, on that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Akash, earlier you described Andy Burnham's approach to devolution as shooting for the stars, and I was kind of keen to ask what your feedback would be on Steve Khan's where his bar stands, because obviously he's completely thrown out any devolution in health and doesn't see any case for it. Do you think that the Manchester model shows there is some case that we should be arguing?
It's a very different devolution model. I mean, as I've just said, actually, in terms of the health devolution, it's striking that, well, that was not a deal that the mayor had anything to do with, because it preceded the mayor. It was a local authority-led arrangement in the first instance, and certainly having come in as mayor and very much established himself as the leader of the region, Andy Burnham certainly has a big role to play in sort of setting the direction, and he's a former Minister for Health and has got a lot of background in that. Whether you could directly apply that model to London, larger scale, different geography of NHS organisations, different relationship between the mayor and local authorities, I'm not sure I'm totally qualified to answer that, I'm afraid.
Thanks. And Vicky, now we'll turn to you, because I think that last element, just to bring that in and wrap in some of these questions together, is the complexity as well, and whether a model of devolution for health would work in London.
Thank you, Councillor. So, I mean, the complexity comes from a range of places. We've had a project ongoing between London, Manchester and the West Midlands around city health inequalities and work at a regional level, where we've had a chance to explore some of this, and I'll share the link to the reports with the committee. But, for London, we are, 9 to 10 million people, 5 different integrated care systems, 32 plus 1 councils, with a far more mobile and often transient population, and quite a different age kind of profile within the population. Both Manchester, West Midlands, less than a third of the population. Manchester and London, we share the advantage of being a co-terminus city with our 5 CSs. They share the advantage of being a co-terminus So us for a city and a region, them as a city with their integrated care systems. And some of the learning that's come out for us has been also the advantage in talking to West Midlands colleagues around the challenge of working across multiple integrated care systems for them where they haven't got that coterminosity, as well as the LEPs and the other ways in which public sector services are organised. So there's a nice linear connection in Manchester in being a single integrated care system around population health outcomes that you're trying to seek, and the role of different agencies with that coterminosity, which is tricky, much more tricky in London. And the scale of London, to set that out for a population of this size also is incredibly tricky. The Mayor has set out the role in this administration around champion, challenging and collaborating with those 5 integrated care systems and bring them together through the Health Board. From a Manchester perspective, and if you were to talk to a single integrated care system, certainly the work we did in BHR, there's huge appetite to do some of the kinds of work that Manchester is doing around connections between adult social care, for example, and housing colleagues. So undoubtedly in London, we can bring, as a strategic authority, some of that perspective around housing, around police, which goes back to the health and all policies work that we can do at the region. But the action in joining up care pathways, which is how you get the change in outcomes, is delivered through integrated care systems in London and at that level of geography. And to the idea that you'd hoover that up to a regional level would be, incredibly tricky.
Thanks. Vicky, in some of those arguments as to why devolution wouldn't work, and I saw that in the GLA FAQ document on London health and devolution around our population being more diverse, significantly larger, pronounced inequalities, pioneering new drugs, techniques, technologies, national stuff as well. A lot of those arguments could be put on the Met Police as well, but of course the Mayor has overall control of the Met. So what do you see as the distinct differences in that argument?
There are some elements of devolution which are enabling powers to enable local areas to do what they feel they need to do. And some of those are public health, potential for supporting local government, for example. So something like a licensing objective around health, there's been a lot of debate around that. That could enable work to happen. I think if you're talking about how subsidiarity, tackling local health needs in a population that changes quickly and significantly, there are elements of planning in London that do happen at the regional level around urgent care, emergency care, that are planned at that level, but the vast majority of care needs to be very much rooted into primary care, referrals, community services, adult social care, and an ongoing way, not in terms of deploying resource in to tackle an event, a crime, not that kind of deployment, but constant ongoing service delivery through things like management of long-term conditions, rollout of screening and immunisation services, where you have to really know your population. Not the police don't, but you're not in that position of kind of deployment.
Thanks. I think let's take it. We're on separate pages on that argument. There was a conversation about the London Ambulance Service coming under mayoral control for a while, or coming under the GLA, and that was dismissed as well. To me, it strikes that we have the institution set up, we have the capacity and scrutiny, we have the resources, we have the convening power. If we had slightly more devolution, we do know our population in terms of health. We could make much more of an impact on people's health outcomes. Do you think we should be fighting more for health devolution in London? The Mayor should be fighting more for health devolution as well.
With regards to that, it will require a change in legislation and due diligence. The only other comment I'd offer is around clinical governance arrangements, which are well embedded within the NHS. Some of those have been redeveloped as public health services moved into local government, and the same would be true as part of that due diligence process for the GLA, if that was to happen.
Perhaps there's some of that argument that came earlier about it being easy as well with devolution to shift this problem back to ministers. So it's quite easy actually on Health Committee to turn around and say, not our problem. and actually we'd have to take a lot more of the impetus then, I suppose. I just wanted, before finishing that section on health, if that's okay, Chair, ask if anybody else wanted to contribute. Tony.
I'd just pick up the discussion and the points you've just made. I think accountability for the National Health Service in London is almost impossible to understand. I think it is very, very difficult to know who is making decisions, why they are made, whether the NHS is efficient or not. I could go on. Debates that take place in this chamber and the politics of the Assembly do allow a debate of that kind to take place about transport, policing, and the fire and emergency functions that are vested in the Mayor. So I think that for the NHS, frankly for schools, and it's note we now have an NHS London region, we're going to have a newer schools region, a London education region soon, under the proposals in the schools white paper. So I think the difficulty, not unique to London, but certainly very visible here, where London is stand out different to England as a whole, that holding public services to account, fully understanding whether they're efficient, whether they're well run, whether they are responsive to people, all 9 million people in London, I think is terribly, terribly difficult under the current arrangements. And until and unless there is more capacity for decisions to be made at the subnational level, as again they are in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, that difficulty will remain.
May I come in briefly? Of course. So I think health is really complicated. It's probably one of the least centralised bits of decision making in England in terms of kind of what is prescribed, what decisions are made at a local level. So the example that's always used is IVF, that the eligibility for IVF in Greenwich is different to Bexley. I think it's hard to comment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think the context for the discussion about healthcare devolution in England strikes me as being a little bit different to the context for the discussion about some other aspects of devolution, and indeed some of the international comparisons where you do have greater centralisation of health decision making in certain European countries are also different.
Okay, I've just seen Dr. Onka Sahota would like to come in very briefly on health.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I've been listening to this debate on devolution and health, and my question is towards Vicky. We have an underfunded NHS, underfunded social services across London, and bringing together two underfunded budgets under the mayoralty doesn't make sense at all until the government decides to fund the services appropriately. But I think one area which may be suitable for devolution is public health on a central basis, right? And that's actually unfortunately where it's been fragmented. Public health has been fragmented in London into 32 boroughs, when it would have been better to be at the devolved to the mayor. And the other one is improving primary healthcare services in the capital. So, Vicky, do you think there's a appetite or a sensible thing for those things to happen? A public health approach was to put into a citywide approach under the mayoralty, and reforming public health, so reforming primary care.
Who's that addressed to?
Vicky, I thought.
Oh, sorry, Vicky.
So not to like it, I think we'll need to ask the Mayor's Office that in terms of what that appetite is. Certainly in terms of the transition, public health, we're coming up to 10 years from that transition to local government, and the levelling up agenda in terms of the resources available to local government. Certainly that's been a challenging debate over these past 10 years, putting aside the kind of total allocation, but the allocation that's made on the basis of need is probably, there was a commitment to that right at the beginning, and there, it's probably time for that to be kind of revisited fairly soon, I would say.
I think I missed the most of it probably because of the sound quality. But my question was really, does it make sense, right, to have public health devolved to a central citywide policy making, and also reforming primary care, which has two fragmented services in London where we could have a lot of impact. Do you think that would make sense? I'm not asking you whether the mayor has the upside or not, but does it make sense from a public health point of view?
I think we'd have to make the case around, I'm sorry if the sound is poor, I think we'd have to make the case for that around what difference is that going to make around cost, quality, outcomes, and the health inequalities that those services and functions are mitigating beyond what we are achieving already through the arrangements we have in place, through a London health inequality strategy, through the commitments to a vision, through the commitments to recovery, where health and health inequalities are a cross-cutting principle, where we've got commitment across the GLA group for a public health unit to support the organisation increasingly to make its contribution. What's the value add of that? What would be the value add of that?
Thank you, Vicky.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Thank you for that additional contribution. And thank you very much, Vicky. Obviously, if you want to stay and listen to the rest of it, but we are going to be moving on from the subject of health, and we're going to be moving over to Assembly Member Prince, who's going to be asking about skills and employment, and also, I believe, we'll touch on transport as well.
Thank you, Chair. So first question is to all. I guess we probably start with Tony. We seem to be. What could London achieve with further devolution of skills and employment funding?
Well, there's no doubt that skills and employment funding, as with all non-university post-school education, has vastly less attention given to it than all other parts of the education system. And there's no question that London does it incredibly well in terms of schools, its universities work very well as a system individually. But for this part of the system, and not only in London, it works less well. That's partly because successive governments, national politics, has always found it harder to work out what's going on. It has less contact with it. There's different funding streams, again, for skills and non-university post-schools education are very much harder to work out what they are. So would it be better if, as I said for health, if London were a focused accountability point for it? Yes, without question. And if you look at the back to the levelling up debate, only in the United Kingdom would you have a policy that, it's not always, but regularly seen as levelling up, meaning London is doesn't need any help. No, I know that's not true what everybody thinks, and certainly not all ministers and shadow ministers really think, but it's easy to believe that. And yet London has very high levels of unemployment on average, and in some parts of the city and some communities, levels of unemployment that remain high, particularly amongst some less well-off individuals, whatever the economy is doing. And against that backdrop, this part of the education system, without question, will be better managed much nearer to where the needs are, as indeed were its origins. The origins of technical education were at the local level. There are FE colleges all around the city, get much less attention than universities, and without doubt, a greater London focus on those institutions and private delivery of services in this sphere would improve the accountability, which I keep going back to, but also for the people who have been left behind by the system, and London does need levelling up help, they would get a more sensitive service.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to comment?
I completely agree. I will just add very briefly that I think there is a serious problem with kind of accountability and management of skills services. I would argue that the even more serious problem is funding. And unless we can find a way, whether at London or national level, to get more funding into skills services, some of those problems would be solved, others would remain.
Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we spoke before, of course, quite a bit about fragmentation of funding streams. I think skills and employment is one of the best examples of that. And again, you know, based on conversations with metro mayors and people working in combined authorities and so on, it's I think this is probably the best case where some of the functions that have been devolved, the adult education budget in particular, are very helpful, valued levers in their own right, but they are one little part of a complex, interconnected system. And when you have accountability for different parts of an interconnected system sitting at different tiers, I think it doesn't make for either clear accountability or better outcomes, because you're not able to design those kind of joined up systems that support people to, you know, throughout their life and to continue to upskill and to help people back into work or into better jobs. So I think it's a key area for that. It's very much on the agenda again in those trailblazer negotiations with Greater Manchester and West Midlands. So once again, I think it's a good example of where collaboration across the M10 group and with local government more generally is probably going to be very valuable. We'll see where the government comes out on it. DFE is not generally regarded as one of the most pro-devolution departments. Things can change with new ministers and prime ministers and so on, of course. But I think there's been some worrying signs, actually, even, you know, since things like AEB were devolved, of government going back to its tendency to want to have its own initiatives to announce things like the Multiply scheme through UK Shared Prosperity Fund, skills, boot camps and those kind of things. All may be great ideas in their own right, but I think once again threatens to take us down a path of more fragmentation. So obviously to the extent that one can argue against that, that would be welcome.
Can I just come in there? Could you be specific? I mean, certainly if you talk, and I was talking to businesses only yesterday as London First became Business London, and we've talked about this on the Economy Committee, actually, when myself and Assembly Member Hall were Chair and Deputy Chair of that, and the split budgets between adult education, apprenticeships and all these different pots of money. Is that what you're talking, that it would be a lot easier if those were all brought together as one area that could then be more flexibly applied rather than having all of these different fragmented pots and initiatives?
In a nutshell, yes. I mean, there's sort of 16 to 18, which is again separate and maybe harder to devolve for various reasons. But then even sort of post 19. You've got adult education, you've got apprenticeships funding, you've got things that, you know, employment support through DWP, and then you've got, as I say, sort of specific programs coming in through UK Shared Prosperity Fund, skills boot camps, and I'm sure other things as well. People have tried to compile full lists of them, which I don't have to hand, but essentially, I think that's the direction I'd want to see moving.
I can see that Tony Travers wants to come in. You might have a bit of skin in this game from the LSE.
Just to add to Akash's point, about 7 or 8 years ago now, I was invited to and chaired a skills and employment commission for Wolverhampton City Council. Wolverhampton, good council, good links to local businesses, successful use of apprenticeships, good local university, good local FE college, links to Warwick University, system. The officers of the authority who tried, and they were very good, could not provide a full list of all the funding streams for skills and employment, try as they might. Was to describe it for schools or universities, you can do it in a sentence, but not for this sector. And that's evidence of neglect.
Well, that's, I don't think we need to say anything further to that, because that really does speak for itself. Assembly Member Prince, coming back to you.
Oh, thank you. I want to move on to transport now, please. And again, I'll start with you, Tony. What would further transport devolution in London look like, and what do you think would be the benefits?
Well, I think the original devolution settlement, once it had got over the public-private partnership struggle and debacle, giving the Mayor of London responsibility for the underground buses, licensing of private hire vehicles and so on, major roads, all the things that are within the TfL world, was rather a good one. I think it concentrated accountability, which I've said 3 times in different contexts, very clearly with the mayor. It's not like in New York City where there's a terrible argument all the time between the state government, which funds the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and the city, which has very different needs to upstate New York, or Paris, where there's a national agency. We've had a version of that in London in the past. So it concentrated that settlement, accountability for transport in London with the mayor and with you as the Assembly holding the mayor to account. And I know you have direct debates on this issue, which is a good thing. I may not agree with everything that's said, but it's a good thing. So I think it's right the boroughs retain their responsibilities for local transport. I think it's a rational split between the two. I think the sensitivity of what goes on in neighbourhoods in a city that's 620 square miles has to be locally sensitive as well as have the power that TfL has. But going back to something Claire said at the very beginning, the real challenge now is to find a long-term and stable funding mechanism which allows TfL to continue to maintain its networks broadly and services broadly, reflecting the fact that the way work and leisure patterns have changed is substantial. And then this Assembly and the public and the media can hold the Mayor of the Day to account, which I think works far better than, as I was saying earlier, it does for transport or any other service that doesn't have its roots here or in the boroughs.
Thank you.
Are you finished? Okay. And Caroline, you're fine about coming. Did you still want to come in?
Yeah, actually I will. I thought Assemblymember Prince might touch on. I was really interested in whether you see further devolution of suburban rail coming to London, or whether you think actually, I mean, given the Prime Minister previously really championed this, and obviously he doesn't, and we've seen that on other areas, but do we think we're still going to get more rail devolution given the current climate and given its success, actually?
I think if you only have to look at the league tables of which the ORR publishes, Office of Rail and Road publishes, about the performance of railways within their purview to show that the TfL-operated ones work substantially better than the national ones. You may say not always a very high bar, but it's, you know, something. Of course, there are problems with railways that cross the boundary. I get that. There are provisions for TfL to have non-London members on the board of TfL. So do I think it would be better if the commuter railway were run by the Mayor of London, overseen by the London Assembly? Yes. You only have to look at the standard of TfL stations where the underground exists and compare it with, particularly south of the river, where private companies, whoever run them, to see that the standards are a light year apart. So I think driving up, we wouldn't have a citywide fare system, which in fairness to the former mayor, I think he finally required and encouraged the train operating companies to deliver. So I definitely think commuter rail travel in London would be better if TfL ran it.
Just on the point about funding, obviously we had an operating grant for the roads and we gave it up from April 2018. So at the moment, effectively, people who travel on various parts of public transport fund the upkeep of the roads. Does it make sense that we pay in vehicle excise duty as Londoners apparently about 500 million a year, but that all goes into the Department for Transport and we don't get any back? Does it make sense for us to get some of that back to create that sort of funding that we need to keep the roads in or other parts of the transport network fully operational? I'll start with Claire.
I mean, to sort of pick up on the first part of your question, yes, it's absolutely mad that public transport users in London subsidise car drivers, particularly when a minority of Londoners drive. I'm not aware of any other city where that happens. It's extremely peculiar and it's not very fair. I await with interest for data on car ownership, household car ownership, which we're expecting in the census, which I think will make it easier to make some of these equity arguments. That said, as Tony has already said, the way we tax roads and driving and cars needs fundamental reform. So I think there are risks of going after a tax base which we know is declining and we don't know what's going to replace it. This is one of those moments where all roads end up leading back to road user charging as a discussion, I think. It's very hard to, certainly for me, to imagine a system for charging for driving, which we must do because it has all sorts of negative externalities which we must compensate for, as well as being a huge revenue raiser for the Treasury. It's very hard to envisage how that would work in the future without some form of road user charging. And it's been interesting seeing a sort of creeping acceptance of that from organisations who were maybe previously more opposed to it. But I think how we get to that point, what it looks like, who pays what and where that money goes, has the scope to become a very, very complex argument and possibly one of the dominant arguments that we have about transport policy in the next decade.
Okay, so in the sense that we need to probably reassess fuel duty, because if we move to electric vehicles, you know, what are we actually charging the tax on? The same with moving to less individual private ownership of vehicles, and vehicle excise duty is likely to change similarly as a source of revenue raising. That's essentially what you're saying, I think.
Indeed, yes,
Yeah.
and also that the current incentives that are being put in place to encourage the use of electric cars, you know, electric cars are certainly better than petrol and diesel cars, but if you're in an electric car in a traffic jam, you're still causing traffic. So I think we need to have a relook over time at how we balance the incentives to use an electric car over a petrol car versus incentives not to drive at all. And a lot of that incentivisation, I think, is likely to take place through the tax system.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in on this as well? Yep, sure.
Sorry, can you just clarify something for me? You said, Claire, a minority of Londoners drive. Can you tell me where you've got that, where that data's from?
It's from the 2011 census. About half of households in London own a car, but of course many of those are children and therefore do not drive them. As I said, we're looking forward to the 2021 census data, which will give us much more granular information on car ownership at a borough level. There are boroughs, of course, where the majority of households own cars, and there are boroughs where a minority own cars.
Okay, we're running very short of time. If not, I'm sure we'd have a debate on that.
I think we're delving into an area that's interesting but not necessarily completely relevant to the topic at hand. I'm now going to move on to a completely different area again, and this is an area where the Mayor has called for additional powers over the private renters sector around especially the setting of rents. So we were talking much earlier on about land value tax and stamp duty and the whole thing about how do you, when people are, you know, purchasing, what kind of taxes do they pay? But this is an area that could be subject to devolution but currently isn't. So what would be the impact of further devolution in this area? And I'm with Claire, so I'll start with Claire.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question because I was still trying to work out
about more powers for the Mayor over the private rented sector if he had some powers in this area devolved around controls on rent or the setting of rents in the private rented sector.
Thank you, Chair. I think, you know, we know that the PRS in London is unusually large, although growing in some other parts of the country now. So London is not unique in that sense. And it's often one of the things that when we went through my work, I talk to people about what things in London they really want to see fixed. One of the things that always comes up is the PRS. I guess there's two ways you can think about that. One is about rent and whether there should be rent controls, which could be set at a city or a local level. Those are, of course, hugely complicated, complex questions. So lots of quite kind of complex financial implications as well as social implications of doing that, which you probably don't want to get into today. The other is about standards and the potential for landlord licensing, which is of course something that government are consulting on at present. At the moment, when boroughs want to have a landlord licensing scheme, it has to go through central government, which is complex and convoluted. There is a small group of London boroughs who currently have landlord licensing arrangements, but of course landlords who own properties in multiple boroughs then potentially find themselves dealing with multiple licensing systems, which can be complicated for them. So I think there is a case for mayoral control over landlord licensing to enforce higher standards, although it's important that boroughs who want to go further don't feel that they're then kind of being levelled down, as it were. Newham, for example, has stricter conditions than many other local authorities.
I can see that Akash is nodding. Did you briefly want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, briefly. I mean, I was nodding because I couldn't really disagree with anything Claire was saying, and she's obviously thought about it more than I have. I mean, yeah, I think the sort of housing quality and landlord licensing issues or powers are where I would think there's more likelihood of government being open to devolution. I'm sure the Treasury would have lots of instinctive aversion to rent control. Not an economic expert on that, but I think international evidence suggests that does lead to sort of unintended consequences and undersupply of good quality housing, and might actually run contrary to some of the other objectives one is trying to achieve in terms of good quality housing for people.
Well, the availability of housing is obviously is quite an issue. Tony, did you want to come in on this one as well?
I'm going to agree. I mean, I totally agree. I think there's a big argument, powerful argument for, given the unusual nature, the point Claire's made, of the housing system in London, the large privately rented sector and so on, very powerful arguments for regulating it and having the regulation at the London level, probably a bit at the citywide level and some at the borough level. Actually, I agree with that point. But to reinforce what Akash has just said, I think rent controls lead to an array of unintended consequences and market distortions that would require very great certainty before anybody wandered too far in that direction, myself.
I'd love to continue this discussion, but I'm going to...
Look what happens in other cities.
Yes, exactly. I think there's some interesting international comparators, actually, that might speak to this matter. However, I am going to force us to move on to a very topical item, which is about devolution of powers around the Metropolitan Police. And obviously that's incredibly topical. Over to Assembly Member Hall.
It is, and it's the subject closest to my heart. But before, I do think, Chairman, we ought to apologise to our guests for having to sit in this heat. It's unbelievable in here, and we're all suffering, and I'm sure you are. So thank you for bearing with us while we try and get somebody to do something about it. So the question, I don't know who would like to take it first. Should the Mayor lead the process of selecting the Metropolitan Police Commissioner rather than his current consultative role? Who would like to lead with that? Tony, go on, go for it.
Well, I don't want to I mean, it is obviously it's very much in the news and the public domain. We all know the history here, which is that, or the background, which you all know better than me. I mean, the fact is, the Metropolitan Police was for very many years the responsibility of the Home Secretary, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner appointed by the Home Secretary or the Queen on the advice of the Home Secretary. And after 2000, this settlement changed very radically. And of course, although the non-London geographical parts of the Met's area were taken away at that point, the diplomatic, terrorism and other responsibilities of the Metropolitan Police remain. And if they are, as some people have discussed, to be taken away, then you have a profound implication on the need for some new national agency, a bit like a sort of what's often popularly described as a British FBI, which would be complicated, and the Met wouldn't like that. And separately, it might not be the right thing to do anyway. So there will, I think it's for the foreseeable future, certainly for the period of the, it would appear, the newly appointed Metropolitan Police Commissioner, be non-London or national responsibilities within the purview of the Metropolitan Police. So I think against that backdrop, having the Mayor of London alone appointing the Metropolitan Police Commissioner would probably not be appropriate, given the background and the fact that there are these national responsibilities. But I also think that having the Mayor, the Mayor having a role in the appointment of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, given that 90-odd% of all the Met's activities are on the streets of London, that the Mayor definitely should have a role in the appointment. So I'm afraid what I'm going to say is there needs to be a better thought-through version of the current arrangement.
Right, okay. Anybody else got any differing views? No. Right, well, the next question, of course, was to include the part about the national functions.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's good use of our time to combine some of these questions. And given that it is all bunged together, as it were, I think where we are now is where we're going to be, and at least hopefully this will be in place for quite some time, and perhaps if they're going to think about doing something, they can do it in the future. Anybody got differing views on that?
Not different views at all. I think there's an interesting precedent about how the Metropolitan Police works with the British Transport Police, given the very high concentration of major railway stations, which have in recent years been particular concerns of terrorist targets within London. And I'm by no means an expert on this, but my understanding is from those who are much more expert that that relationship is generally taken to go well, which I guess gives me some hope for the possibility of territorial and non-territorial forces working together in London.
Yeah, and of course we mustn't forget the City Police. So, yeah. Okay, so we'll move away from policing. Are there any other potential opportunities that we've not discussed today that should be explored, or that any of you would like to bring up, Tony?
Can I just come back to I know you want to move on, just to the police for a second, because I think in the debate, regularly debates that take place about policing, not only in London, the fact that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and this is particularly important given all that's going on at the moment, the fact that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, in common with other chief constables, is responsible for operational policing is something that is worthy, not today, but worthy of much greater exploration and debate, because I think many members of the public think politicians are to some degree responsible for operational policing, and they may want them to be so on occasion if things go badly wrong. So that borderline between operational policing and non-operational police policy, and the way politicians of all stripes and levels of government talk about it, I do think is worthy of unpacking and discussing if it's exactly the right borderline, and whether or not accountability for police operational decisions, which I realise you hold the police to account in this very chamber, which is unusual, by the way, whether that can be done in a way that makes sense today. Sorry, I'm going to put this correctly. It probably needs to be thought through whether it works as well as it should.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think colleagues all across would agree. Politics, in my view, should be way out of policing. It should be standalone, but that's a personal view. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to see if anyone did want to answer the question about, is there any other areas that need to be, we should consider for being devolved that we haven't answered? Akash, did you want to come in on that?
Sorry, I don't know how much of that you caught. I was just saying, yeah, I mean, the justice devolution model to Greater Manchester is quite an interesting innovation. Again, as with the NHS devolution, it's arguable if it's more like delegation. I mean, it's very much a sort of partnership-based model that brings together, obviously, MOJ with the combined authority, and tries to have a more collaborative approach to offender management, and preventative strategies to keep young people, divert them away from a life of crime and that kind of thing. Once again, I can't claim to say that it's delivered the improved outcomes yet. It's also a pretty new model, but it's an interesting area to watch. The other, and obviously that would link to policing functions very closely. And then the other area I would just mention where actually the Institute for Government's hoping to do some more work, quick advert for that, in terms of potential for devolution in general, is around delivery of net zero, where I think what we're exploring is, again, to go back to the funding conversation, a model whereby a mayor such as here in London, or Andy Burnham, Andy Street, through their Devo deals, could be given guaranteed long-term funding to deliver a certain scale of carbon emission reductions. So there'd be kind of clear, measurable outcome targets, but then with a sort of flexible funding pot that could be invested in EV networks or retrofitting or low energy low energy industries, green skills across a range of functions actually. But then you'd have the accountability would shift to outcomes, and it would be relatively easy to measure in a sense, because it's very clear what you're trying to achieve. It's a single metric. So that's, I think, quite a live area for debate.
Okay, and in fact, actually, there was quite a lot of work done under the first mayor around some of that. I've just seen Assemblymember Duval wants to come in briefly now as well.
So we've talked about devolution of the executive roles in some ways to London. Let's just turn to the scrutiny roles. And it's really to the three external guests. Education, health, and there's one other I'd probably put in there. Do you not think there is a role for, one of the issues is the acceptance that we on the London Assembly can do that. Most of our time is scrutiny of the mayor, but in terms of other agencies, so with the establishment of the London-wide education agency, with the establishment of the democratic deficit that's in the health service still, is there a legitimate role for us to extend or get our thinking on a devolution agenda, the role of this Assembly in asking London-specific questions of those bodies? The Environment Agency comes to mind. It's one that does some very detailed work in London. It's a national organisation, but it's also a regional one. Flooding's coming to the fore. But how do you expose it? It was something you said, Tony, about asking questions of others changes the way they relate to the people they purport to serve in some ways. Is there a role for this body or in London to establish a devolution of scrutiny that's not just left?
I'm actually going to ask the guests to hold their thought about that, because this is actually very conveniently moving us on to the next area. Apologies. Where Assemblymember Caroline Pidgeon is going to talk about the powers for the Assembly and the scrutiny role of the Assembly, which is what we've started to move into. So, Assemblymember Pidgeon.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to have to keep pace because I'm going to have to leave, I'm sorry, before the end of this meeting. When you look at the select committee reports looking at the powers of the Assembly, and obviously this is something I've looked at for 14 years, Lem for 22 years, looking at the powers that we have here. The government has said previously that you could strengthen the scrutiny of the Assembly, but that could add additional bureaucracy, so that's a good reason not to do it. And this includes calls that we have made for things like receiving a forward plan from the mayor on what's coming up, having call-in powers for mayoral decisions. Do you agree with the government's view on this? I'm going to go. Who would like to start? Claire's wanted to come in. Claire, off you go.
I mean, to pick up on both your question, Caroline, and Assembly Member Duval's...
Well, I'm going to pick up a lens in a minute, so if you could...
Okay, sure.
So people can't find the door, it's over there with the green sign. As well as being a sauna in here today, the signage is extraordinary in this place.
I think there's a lot of complexity in kind of scrutiny arrangements across the public sector in London generally. I think Jeremy and Enver have now found the door.
They have left the building, yes.
So with schools and academisation, changes to local authority control, the various changes within the NHS, it's very hard, I think, on that basis to argue that providing more information adds additional layers of bureaucracy when there are already so many of them. So I think we're operating in a highly complex system here, which doesn't necessarily answer the question of the wrongs and rights of individual powers for the committee, but I think makes it complicated to it wouldn't be right to argue that the system as it stands is simple.
Okay, Tony, what's your thoughts on forward plan call-in powers? Really quite timid ask, if you ask me, that the Assembly has put forward time and time again, and the Select Committee supported, and yet we've been told no.
Sorry, I mean the thing is, you'll all be aware more than me, really. When the Assembly was set up, it was as part of a reform that introduced this very unusual American version of city government, a directly elected mayor. But of course, in the United States, there had been a formal separation of power between the mayor as the executive and the Assembly as the city council, a legislative body. Yes. And many aspects of the system have been a classic British hybrid ever since. So with that in mind, and of course we now have the experience of the attempt to scrutinise the mayoral combined authorities, which itself is, Akash knows far more about that than I do. We'll come back to that. So I think some form of holding powerful executives to account is essential. Given the fact that the Assembly was not set up with the kind of legislative powers, so it has one or two that are a bit like legislative powers, the two-thirds majority to overturn the budget, but they're such high hurdles as to make them not really, as a city council would work in a where there was a separation of powers. So, I mean, yes, I do think it's worth revisiting these issues, but in a sort of formal, how should this relationship exist in the long term? And I'd add to that, I think select committees you mentioned. Select committees, and I have to admit I've been an advisor to a select committee on and off for a long time, do not require massive amounts of resourcing. They have incredibly good clerks and a limited amount of help from a scrutiny unit within the Commons. But they are very likely, I would argue, clerked and staffed compared with, say, congressional committees, which are massive enterprises. So I don't think giving the Assembly having enhanced scrutiny powers need lead to massive amounts of bureaucracy. And giving the power to call in people and papers, which select committees have, could be strengthened both for them, frankly, but certainly for the scrutiny of city regional mayors.
That's helpful, thank you. But you're almost saying there should be a bigger review, a fundamental review of how it works.
Well, I think just doing it as a tinkering exercise, I think a review of the long-term relationship between the mayor and the Assembly would allow this kind of debate to be had and a consensus reached, which actually a mayor might also agree with, and then might require legislative change.
Okay, and if I move on to the next bit and bring you in, Akash, first, which picks up on the points that Assembly Member Duval was making, should the Assembly be able to effectively scrutinise other aspects of London governance beyond those overseen by the mayoral administration? Assembly Member Duval listed the Environment Agency, for example. I would list Port of London Authority, Royal Parks, and so on. What you know, what's your thoughts on that, and what could be the potential impact?
So it's interesting, actually. I mean, as Tony alluded to, I think there is a debate starting about scrutiny at various levels, and one idea that has come up, I think at various points, but it's certainly being considered now, I think, in terms of scrutiny of metro mayors, is whether you should have or create something along the lines of it wouldn't be the same here in London, but I'm just applying the analogy, a local or regional public accounts committee that would be responsible for, in the way I think you're suggesting, scrutiny of the totality of public spending within a particular geography, rather than simply scrutiny of the particular institution of the mayoral combined authority. I don't know where the government's going to go down that line, but it's something that I've heard suggested by people in and around some of the combined authorities. So, I mean, yes, I think that would be one model. I think I wouldn't underestimate, though, the size of that challenge. I mean, the London Assembly isn't a very big body for the size of the job I think you already have, and the amount of spending that is controlled by the GLA or the mayor that you have to keep oversight of is already quite large. So that may raise questions about the capacity of this institution to carry out that function, and what additional support might be needed, for instance, by bodies like the NAO in feeding in analysis to that process.
Any other thoughts, Tony?
I mean, I'd simply add, and Akash just reminded me that, of course, the government has recently committed itself to introducing an Office for Local Government, which you just reminded me. Now, that's all we know, but the idea is that it will collect information published. It's, not quite the Audit Commission, but it will publish performance data, do some analysis of performance by local government. Now, question, will it apply to mayors? I don't know, but the issue of scrutiny of executives and the data available to allow those who do it to do the job properly is, I think, out in the ether, and presumably, as when and if this new office is created, the Assembly will have a view on it, presumably.
But what are your thoughts around us scrutinising some of these other bodies and having the powers to be able to do that, whether it's Port of London Authority or Royal Parks or Environment Agency?
Well, I mean...
Or London Ambulance Service.
I assume that... Forgive me, I'm not asking you a question, but I assume if you ask them politely, they'll come anyway, won't they? I mean, do they?
Some will,
do they
some
refuse?
won't. We've had bodies in the past, High Speed Rail in the past. HS2 refused to come to a transport committee. We haven't asked them since their current chief exec's in post. Maybe they would change their mind, but we've had people refuse to come before us. Okay,
then I do think that one of those classic British legal requirements added to the Assembly's role, that an organisation which is invited to appear before the Assembly should do so unless there's any reasonable cause why they shouldn't, would help, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The use of the word reasonable always keeps people on the ball.
Okay, I'll leave it there given the time. Thank you, and apologies I have to leave before the end. I have been enjoying this discussion.
Thank you. No, I think we've just covered off all your questions just before you were going, and certainly I know that Thames Water and the Environment Agency, whenever we've invited them to the Environment Committee, for example, to talk to them about why there are so many burst pipes or what's going on this, that and the other, they've always come along to talk about those things, so that is a good point. I'm going to move on, though, to Assembly Member Fortune, who's now going to come in with the next question, and I think we're also going to possibly say goodbye to Assembly Member Prince shortly as well.
Thank you. It's a shame that we're at the end of the meeting, because I think this is the juicy bit. This is the bit I've been looking forward to. I'm so sorry, Professor Travers. I have not read your excellent book, The Mayor at 20, but it is my birthday in a couple of weeks, and I know my mum's watching, so this is the book I'll get. So I apologise if you've covered this off, but from
probably won't remember by now, so you're safe.
Well, I mean, looking at how the mayoralty was originally conceived, and then the scrutiny function that went around it, is it fair to say that the scrutiny function hasn't kept a pace with the increasing amount of devolved powers to the mayor?
Well, I think, as I was sort of hinting earlier, I'm not sure when it was set up. It was set up because, I mean, it was set up as a hybrid, as I say. I mean, if it had been following precisely the American city model, this would have been a legislative body, and the mayor would have been the executive. In Scotland and Wales, as at Westminster, in effect, the cabinet is derived from the legislature, and so that follows the Westminster model. So this model, and indeed in the combined authorities, a different model, are very, very different. Yeah. And that's why there are these challenges. And I do think that there are good arguments for holding powerful executives to account. That's the way our system works. And of course, this assembly resembles in many ways, more than anything, a select committee of the Commons or the Lords. That's what the thing it most resembles. And then the issue is how to use your, and Akash made this point, it's quite a small body. And so with a number of spheres of operation to cover, which are themselves incredibly detailed and data-driven with all sorts of information. There's an asymmetry of information between the Assembly and TfL, the Assembly and the Metropolitan Police Service, and so on. So, but without becoming a great big bureaucracy, which nobody wants, the question of how to make the Assembly's scrutiny more effective, I think, is a mixture of perhaps some new powers, but also the Assembly thinking harder, perhaps, than about how to operate in a non-partisan way to drill down into the deep, statistically driven heart of many of these services. Get more data, follow the data, produce reports based on performance. And I do think that is a noble activity, but it requires coming back to the same issues again and again and again and again.
So I think you're being very polite in elements of that response. And I think I'm relatively new, so I just came on board last May. So I've spent 12 months trying to figure it out. And I think what was implied there is that baked into this system is that almost that political tension, which means that some of the functions that we have, like with the budget process, it's almost written in that it's going to fail. There's absolutely no way that this body, when it's acting politically, can use that tool. And
just to add to that, I mean, yes, I agree with that, but I'd say, and I wrote this in, sort of just plugging my books now, in a much earlier book.
I'm only getting one book for my birthday.
The small nature of the size, and both my colleagues here have written on these kind of issues, but I think given the relatively small size of the Assembly, as compared with, say, the GLC or even Birmingham City Council, which have, you know, the GLC had 100 and then 92 members, the LCC more than 100, I think. That has the intriguing consequence of making the operation of the Assembly less formal than if it were bigger. Yeah. And if it were bigger, you'd have much more formalised procedures that I think would require a more formal relationship with the mayor, and so on and so on. It's too big an issue to go into detail here. So I do think that, and I'm not advocating a huge assembly, but it's just something to bear in mind, because select committees have to operate in a particular way, usually consensually, 100% consensually, and they can get a long way. They don't always get the government to respond or to do what they want. And so I think that it's as you're implying with your questions, well worth going deeper into all of this and then, you know, looking at it in further detail.
Because I think there's and you know, I did this right at the beginning as well. You make a false comparison, I think, with Scottish devolution, Welsh devolution, because you tend to do it by population number, and that's not an accurate measurement. It's actually about what's the efficiency. I've been, you know, watching you play accountability bingo with every answer that you've given, which is where does that accountability sit? So, Akash, I know that you've written about select committees, haven't you? And you've done reports on it. Didn't mean to put you on the spot, but that's what I read in your bio.
a long time ago, and maybe that's a reminder to me to update the bio. But please ask the question, and we'll see if I can be helpful.
So can you see, as I think Tony was saying, there's an opportunity for us to align along that sort of select committee model, and to perhaps be a more effective scrutiny body?
Yeah, I mean, I do see it as quite a useful analogy. The functions, yeah, as Tony's discussed, of the Assembly include some formal powers, but that are rarely used in terms of if you can reach 2/3 majority or whatever, which doesn't happen to amend the budget. So yes, otherwise the core functions are in the scrutiny space, and so then to make the Assembly more effective and impactful, yes, I think it does come down to the ability of the Assembly to work together in a non-polarized, non-partisan way to identify maybe tighter priorities of what are the real areas of concern or issues to dig into further as far as performance of the GLA and services it controls are, and maybe given the small size, really target your focus on the big issues rather than trying to spread the limited capacity too thinly.
Because as you get, as we've been talking about today, increased powers, increased responsibilities to the mayor, you're going to have a suitable function sitting around that.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing that has to happen, of course, is that somebody upstairs, as it were, has to have that political mandate to do it. And I apologise because I've used it before, but there's the Juncker clause, isn't there, that everybody knows what to do, but nobody knows how to get re-elected after they've done it. So central government gives all this power away to an elected mayor, and then the problem comes back to that accountability and that thread back to the electorate. So I represent the glorious boroughs of Bexley and Bromley, and I know that the hundreds of them that watch this on YouTube would have leapt up when Claire talks about car ownership, because we've got car ownership of 75% and 74% and no tubes. So it's when they watch conversations in this room and then they look around their local environment and they don't see any connection to that, they feel disconnected to what goes on here, and they might feel that there's not that proper scrutiny or their voice isn't being heard, and you just get into this horrible mix where you don't get to move forward because people are talking along different lines. I think I confused my argument there a little bit.
No,
but,
I mean,
I think there's a
sorry.
symbiotic relationship around that power, that Devo power, and the scrutiny that goes along with it, and I don't think they've moved together in a pace.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as further powers and flexibilities are devolved, you do need the accountability and scrutiny mechanisms to grow with them, and I think it's always a temptation of government and maybe mayors as well, not specifically the current mayor, but mayors in general, not to want to invest in that capacity. That's certainly something that I've heard said at MCA level, again Metro Mayor level, is that because the resourcing for the scrutiny and oversight committees within mayoral combined authorities is just a little slice of the combined authority budget, it's always going to be deprioritised and is not really fit for purpose as a result. So yeah, I mean, I think government needs to take it seriously and invest more in the scrutiny capacity. It's not realistic that the Assembly is going to be increased in size, I wouldn't have thought, because nobody ever votes for more politicians. But if you were starting from scratch, you might want to have a larger body given the scale of the task. And then, yes, I think the need for better data performance analysis to inform the scrutiny of committees such as this one and others. That's a really important part of the picture. I mean, I mentioned the NAO before, but then, yeah, the new Office for Local Government, I learnt just yesterday in Whitehall, it's already been called OFLOG, by the way, in conversation with some civil servants about it. That's possibly going to become an important part of the system. I think Whitehall, on that front, has to be very careful that it isn't seen to create an audit commission 2.0 that's just there to cause problems for, or create a new bureaucratic burden for local and devolved government, and is actually being set up in a co-designed way to help local decision makers. So it's another one of those, we'll see where it ends up, parts of the picture, but I think that could be a helpful innovation. I know there's been one other point, just quickly. I know there's been proposals made for the Assembly to have something like an independent budget office, I think, to inform scrutiny. Something like that could be quite valuable. It's something that's been created in other parliaments around the world, I think, to help inform the budget scrutiny process.
Off-log is going to become log-off, which I'll do, but thank you.
I always thought Gol and Gozy were bad enough, but off-log is literally ridiculous, but no doubt we'll all grow to love it as much as we love LFIPA, although that also vanished, and FREP, which of course replaced it. And then we're very good on acronyms in this chamber. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Hall, who's got a couple more questions just at the end here.
Yes, and I'll be quite brief, but I must let my colleague know that Professor Travers is always exceptionally polite. Whatever one says, he's always exceptionally polite. And just to say to you, we are so frustrated because very often we do make recommendations, we do drill down, but because we don't have the powers to actually make anything happen. And that is so frustrating for all of us, and I can say that. And of course, our budget, the Assembly's budget in comparison to the Mayor's, is being squeezed. Well, the Mayor's is not. I'll leave it at that, giving thought to my colleagues. Right, I'm back on my favourite subject, policing, again. Should the London Assembly have a consultative role in the selection of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner and the London Fire Commissioner, or the powers to hold confirmation hearings like other posts that are accountable to the Mayor? What do you think? Who wants to start? Let's go with... all right, Akash.
I'll be brief because I don't have a strong view on exactly what is the right model there. But, I mean, I am generally a fan of confirmation type hearings. To go back to piece of work I did do on select committees was specifically on the role of committees in a public appointment process, whereby government ultimately still makes the final decision. There's no veto powers, with a couple of exceptions actually, like over OBR appointments in Parliament, but for the most part, select committees get to interview obviously on the public record nominees for important public roles, and can highlight any question marks about whether that might be the most suitable member or person to fulfil that role. I think on the whole that's quite a useful function, though it can be a tendency to politicise some of those roles if the committees don't kind of fulfill their function in the way that one would hope they would, and I'm sure that would be the maybe the reason why government would be loath to go down that path if there was a risk that policing or police commissioner appointments might become more politicised. But in principle, I do think that is the kind of function that committees, such as your own or the policing committee here at the Assembly, would be well placed to carry out.
Okay, anybody got any? Tony?
I mean, hard to be against the idea of confirmatory hearings. I mean, it seems to me that if major positions are being filled to run significant public services across the city, then having a way, going back to what I was saying about the accountability of these services to the public, having an opportunity for the senior officers, when they're being appointed or when they're in post, to explain to an elected assembly why they make the decisions that they do, or what they're going to do if they get the job. I think I agree with Akash. I'm broadly on side with this too. The only the big question is, should there be a right of veto? And I think the answer to that is probably not. So that's where we're always saying about balances of power here. So confirmatory hearings, yes, what would happen if the Assembly voted no, and then the Mayor or Home Secretary or both rejected that veto? So there'd have to be a thought-through way of getting these balance of power things right. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that's where I'd say the difficulty might lie. And of course, going back to Parliament, one of the things about parliamentary committees, particularly the very powerful ones like the Public Accounts Committee, is that they have an opposition chair as a matter of, it's the norm. They have but of course the government will have a majority. So it's got an opposition chair and a government majority. And that dynamic is a very interesting one. So I'm not saying that answers this question, but it's germane to the broader question of delivering consensual outcomes in what is always going to be a political environment. I like politics, so I'm not being anti-political at all.
No, and we understand that situation. And we also understand that it's difficult for members, when it's their mayor or MPs, if it's their government. We all do understand that. Whilst we row about it, we completely understand it. The next question, of course, was about the fact that the London Assembly confirmation hearings are non-binding, so that you've touched on that. Sorry. The last question, therefore, I'll put to you. Do you think there should be confirmation hearings for all deputy mayors?
I mean, I guess that's a complicated question because of the complexities of the roles of deputy mayors. And I suppose the question that it raises for me rhetorically is, would doing that change the way that the mayor chooses to appoint deputy mayors and change the roles of those deputy mayors, and would that be desirable? It feels like a role that's so, I hesitate to say undefined, but let's say defined differently by different incumbents at different times, that, and possibly in ways that were not entirely anticipated by the initial legislation that set up the GLA and the Assembly. But that's quite a difficult question to ask because of the sort of undefinedness of the role. Sorry, I should have said it's a difficult question to answer, not a difficult question to ask.
But do you think that it might make a mayor of any party think twice if they've got somebody that they know could not answer proper questions if put to them?
I'm sure it would. I suppose the question then becomes, what are the results of that? And again, that comes back to a really profound question, which is what is the role of deputy mayors, sort of beyond their individual remits? Tony?
I mean, I think going back to the original creation of the GLA, the idea was, and as is true in Merrill, and I keep referring to the US, but that's where most of these ideas came from, and there are directly elected mayors in lots and lots of other countries. But I think the idea was, in the, was it 2+10? I now forget what the numbers were, the initial, that the mayor would have a couple of political advisors and then 10 people in a policy unit. Forgive me if I've got those numbers wrong. Well, this is Britain, and everything then just takes on a life of its own, and it becomes what it is, and the Livingston system's different to the Johnson system, different to the Khan system, and that's true of prime ministers and cabinets besides. So I think this is not a way of not answering your question. The answer is, I think for those, given that we're operating with this legislation that didn't really envisage the creation of deputy mayors, though they have been created within the purview of the initial law. I think for direct appointments to the mayor's office, my answer would be no. I think that the mayor needs to be, given it's a personal mandate, the mayor needs to be able to appoint, now X, I don't know what the number is, a number of people to work with them in their private office. But then the question is, like the cabinet, is 23 the right number? Is X the right number? So I think I could draw a distinction between major offices such as the commissioners, and possibly even some others, where it's a major city role with a degree of independence in the operation of that employment, that role, and the mayor's office, where the mayor needs to be able to appoint people who are their people, to do the job. Now, that's not to say they shouldn't come to you and be held to account by the Assembly, but I think probably not confirmatory hearings, but I could see it on another day. I might argue the exact opposite, to be honest.
Well, we'll have to ask you on another day then,
Sorry.
Professor Travers. Okay, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is it really fast? Because yes, better be.
Professor Travers, you've written many books in your life, but two you've written one is called London Boroughs at 50 and London Boroughs at 20. So London Mayors at 20. And the debate we'll be having today, do you think there's a case to write a book, The London Assembly at 22?
Well, in looking for a third volume in this, what looks to be vanishingly short series, unless we all live for a lot longer than I'm expecting to, the City of London at 1,000 was the nearest I could get to the next one in the series. But I do think, the self-awareness of politics and politicians looking at their own system, thinking about it, discussing it and reporting on it is actually good for and of itself for accountability to the public. Seriously.
Can I just update the committee? Because my mother's texted me to say that your book is now in the basket. It's Amazon Prime Day and you've lucked out. That's live.
Other online suppliers are available of books. I really am very keen to finish at 5, and it's like 5:02 now.
Just a quick question for the panel. In terms of if those who support devolution down to London boroughs, is the number of London boroughs a barrier to further devolution in terms of economic delivery of services?
I'd say it's certainly a complexity to further devolution, and one thing we haven't touched upon today, but we might in a different situation have touched upon, is the role of sub-regional partnerships, which might form a useful bridge between that. But the very short answer to your question is 32 boroughs is an awful lot, but I cannot see any approach to reducing that number succeeding politically. There isn't much of a history of that sort of success.
We have a very interesting situation in the southwest where a shared staffing arrangement was set up between what was at the time 2 boroughs run by the same political party, neither of which are now run by that political party and are run by 2 different parties. And it can be complicated. You're quite right.
As a personal view, I've thought a lot about this. Actually, most of the boroughs, are bigger than many cities outside London. I mean, Bromley, Barnet, Croydon, about Tower Hamlets increasingly. I mean, they're bigger than Leicester and Derby and, big cities outside London. And I often think reorganisations, not particularly only of local government, because there are some arguments for unitaries outside London that are still going ahead, but, reorganisations in the NHS, reorganisations in the police, displacement activity. If there's a problem, let's think what the political problem is and solve it, rather than, I know you're not suggesting it. So I think reorganising the boroughs, as Claire's implied, would be a lot of effort, and I'm not quite sure what problem it would be solving.
Okay, that's slightly outside of the scope of our brief, but certainly if you add the population of Croydon to the population of Wandsworth, that's about the same as the whole of Amsterdam, which is often quoted to us as being somewhere we should look to for lots of guidance on many things, including transport. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our external guests and also to our internal guests who've joined us this afternoon. We've now reached the end of the question and answer session. The committee has got some further items of business, which I hope we're going to finish quite quickly, but if which you're very welcome to stay for, but should you wish to leave the chamber, if you can find the door, because it's obviously disguised today, do feel free to leave us. Thank you. The committee is now asked to note the report which we received in advance of today's discussion as background to putting our questions. Is that noted? Thank you. And if the committee is also minded to delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with the deputy chairman and the party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion which we've just had. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. I'm not going to take an adjournment at this time. I'm going to move straight on to the rest of the agenda because we're so close to time. But we are going to be joined by Helen Ewan, who is the Executive Director of the Assembly Secretariat for the next two work programme items. So the next item, item 6, is the London Assembly Work Programme for all of the committees. That's pages 25 to 26 in your agenda. And also, we had a copy of Appendix 1, which was circulated on the email and is also laid on the table for you to look at today. So the committee is being asked to approve the work programme and approve the headline priorities for the Assembly. But I just wondered if I could just ask Helen, obviously this reached us quite late, and I wondered if you could just talk us through the genesis of the document just before we hopefully agree it, because there's a number of people in the room who've seen it a couple of times.
Of course, thank you, Chair, and thank you. I know we are short of time. Firstly, an apology that it did come to you so late, far from ideal, and we didn't want to test your patience on this, just reflected some final stage discussions that we needed to have. Hopefully much of it will be familiar to you from prior discussions at committee level or elsewhere. It is fairly standard practice for the work programme to come to this committee for approval. Obviously there will be elements of committee business that are not set out here because discussions are ongoing or because committees have opted to retain some flexibility into the year, you know, as we would all want to be able to respond to ad hoc events or to emerging issues. However, we hope we have got here a pretty broad and solid reflection of the ambitions for each committee. Our aim was to get this to you as early as we could in the year, for all the obvious reasons. Supports hugely with planning, with ensuring we can get the right guests before our committees, but there is a broader benefit here too, obviously, in our ability to speak externally and internally to the wider GLA about the work the Assembly intends to do, about its ambitions for the year, and we have brought out here what we think seem to be the emerging priorities for the Assembly. And I know in the past we have talked about a forward agenda, but I'm not aware in recent years that we've really tried to boil it down into priorities as such. The benefits that we see in doing this are predominantly in communication terms, in how we express the, you know, to build on the conversation that you've just been having with colleagues in the previous session, to express the overall impact of the Assembly as a whole, rather than just individual committee lines of activity. That is not to fetter committees in any way. This is not we don't seek to suggest that this is the only areas of focus or interest, but potentially could towards the end of the year lead to some quite interesting drawing together of conclusions around some key themes and issues. Finally, the other obvious benefit here is that we are able to look across the committees and think about where there is potential for overlap, duplication, and on the positive side, the potential for coordination and close working together. And we would want to work closely with the chairs to think about where investigations can really build on each other, where there is mutual areas of interest.
Thank you very much for that. I just need to draw the committee's attention to the fact that in the Environment Committee under topics, it should be changed from just transition to green transition, I think, to assist with all those who don't know what a just transition is. And I believe also potentially there's missing from budget and performance a mention of the green bonds, which needs to go in. And I've just seen that Assembly Member Best wants to raise something.
Thanks. I'm glad you raised that on environment, because I was thinking, at what point was I lost on that committee that I didn't understand what a just transition was? Helen, thanks for that. I'm just looking at the priority themes, those almost keywords that have been used: climate change, COVID, recovery, cost of living, and safety. Where did those come from? Was that what you were? Is that from you?
So I think that was the proposition as we looked across the work streams coming forward. They seemed to be themes emerging from a number of the investigations that were coming to the fore. So they are very much some of the themes that we tested with committees at the back end of last term and that seem to emerge. But they are absolutely lifted from the investigations rather than things that
that individual chairs have specified.
I feel like in some cases things have tried to be shoehorned in to fit a keyword, or in some cases they don't reflect that topic, or in some cases groups would take a different view. For example, in transport under ULE's ED proposals, that you've used a keyword of climate change. I'm sure many in the Conservative group would put cost of living as most applicable.
Yeah, and this is very much a kind of draft proposition. As I say, it is not designed to limit or define where individual things sit. I mean, I think we're clear that many of these topics you'll see from the table, you can see where they cut across a number of these themes. So that's not an active exclusion if there are things that people think are in the wrong place or should be added in. And also, to be clear, this doesn't determine a particular product or the particular way that we would approach the scoping of an investigation. It's a genuinely open question as to whether the committee sees some benefit in beginning to think in priorities in this way.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is not sure this is the place to have an open question. I think it probably came before this paper at today's meeting, because it seems to me, I don't think we will reject the work programme. But
well, I'm seriously hoping we won't, because this has been to all the party group leaders who have, I believe, seen this more than once.
No, that's what I'm saying. So on the priority themes, I think that seems a surprise to some people. But I
believe that's been to the leaders as well. I mean, my understanding is that this has been agreed by all 4 party group leaders at discussion, and there may be some adjustment of the themes that relate to the specific topics, but I don't see that as a barrier to us agreeing the specific topics for the programme of activity. I think the more important thing is that we have the programme of activity and the topics for the meetings that we can agree, and the specific priority theme that relates to a specific topic, I think, can be adjusted.
Yeah, no, definitely. I kind of just want to record that I'm not in agreement with the priority themes. Although I don't think that's a big enough reason to obviously vote against the work programme, but I thought it important to raise.
So, Chair, just to say exactly that, the decision is around the work programme. The secondary point, if you like, is around the themes. I'm very, very happy to pick up points with colleagues afterwards.
So, moving then to approving the proposed work programme for the London Assembly's various committees as set out in Appendix 1, and approving the headline priorities, which may or may not be adjusted to specific topics, which are set out in paragraph 4.2 of the report. So they are set out as a generalisation. So if you could approve those 2 things, that would be very helpful. I'm not seeing anyone saying no. Okay, so the next item of business is the GLA Oversight Committee work programme, which is found on pages 29 to 34, which I hope you've also had a chance to look at. Yes. Is that? Can we note our work programme as well, our own work programme?
Thank you.
Okay. The date of the next meeting is going to not be, I'm afraid, until Wednesday the 13th of September, and that will be at 10 o'clock, and it will be in this very place. There is no other business I consider to be urgent. I declare this meeting very well and truly closed.